the Welsh First Minister and the Permanent Secretary of the Welsh Government to this special session in the Welsh Parliament on interinstitutional relations within the United Kingdom. Could I ask each of our witnesses to identify themselves formally for the record, please?
Yes, Carwyn Jones, First Minister of Wales.
Sian Morgan, Permanent Secretary for the Welsh Government.
Thank you. We've got a lot... sorry.
Oh, sorry. Piers Beeson, Director for European Transition in the Welsh Government.
Thank you for being with us as well. We've got a lot to rattle through and then a train to catch. So if we can keep the questions short and the answers equally short, we will get through, and I'll be very grateful for that. And if it carries on a bit, I shall have to push you on. Can I start by asking, I remember the last time we came, you didn't feel you were getting your quality time with the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and you made that very clear, your frustration. How often have you spoken to the present Prime Minister and seen her, and how are those relations with the Prime Minister now?
We've had 2 phone calls since 2016, and we've met 5 times. We've not met for some time. The meetings have generally been with the First Secretary of State rather than with the Prime Minister. They've been more fruitful meetings in terms of delving into the detail, and of course there have been regular meetings of the JMC-EN, which have looked at issues such as common frameworks and how we move forward more generally.
And how does this compare with previous Prime Ministers?
It's not as good.
It's not as good. So it's got worse.
Yes, in terms of frequency and in terms of what the meetings are about. There was much more engagement with the previous Prime Minister, much more debate, much more an understanding of where he stood on issues. We would often discuss issues. We would often disagree, but at least we knew where we stood. But in terms of the quality of the discussions within those meetings, it's certainly not as good as it was previously.
And of course, we've just had a change of First Secretary of State. When did you first meet David Lidington?
Last week, in person in his current role, with a phone call about 2 weeks previous to that. It was a very good meeting, I have to say. His predecessor, Damien Green, those meetings became better as time wore on. But the meeting last week certainly was very useful, and we discussed a number of issues.
What exactly has been the topic of the discussions?
Clause 11 features very strongly in those discussions. The frameworks that are being looked at for areas such as agriculture and fisheries, and most pressing at the moment, the need for amendments in the Lords to the Withdrawal Bill to ensure that I'm in a position to recommend a legislative consent motion to the Assembly.
We'll come on to that. Thank you very much. Cheryl Gillan.
Cowan, first of all, it's really good to see you again.
Yeah, welcome back.
And thank you so much for hosting us here. I feel as if it's sort of coming home in a funny sort of way, coming down here. Just to press you a bit on ministerial and intergovernmental relations. How often have you been meeting with the First Minister of Scotland? I appreciate at the moment Northern Ireland is a bit of a hiatus, but...
I've not met personally with the First Minister of Scotland since August. I have had phone calls since then. There is day-to-day contact between officials, and there's been more regular contact between Mark Drakeford, Cabinet Secretary for Finance, and his equivalent in Scotland, Mike Russell.
Would you say, sort of over the period of time that you've been First Minister, that you are having less contact or more contact with the Scottish Government and Parliament?
It's about the same.
It's about the same.
On this issue, of course, we face similar challenges in terms of Clause 11, but in terms of my personal contact with my colleague in Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, it's about the same.
Okay, and so you've not increased the frequency of your contacts specifically during this period where we're considering Brexit?
No, because the day-to-day machinery has been the responsibility of Mark Drakeford and Mike Russell, and they have been involved in more meetings together, and indeed, because they represent the respective governments in the JMC-EN, the contact has tended to be between them reporting back to us.
Does that flow through to officials as well? I mean, is it, hello. Are you having increased contacts with the Scottish Government and with the...
If I could ask Piers perhaps to come in on this.
Absolutely.
sorry.
So on a range of issues related to European transition and the UK's exit from the EU, then that gives rise for new areas to discuss with Scottish Government officials and then with UK Government. So both in support of the JMC arrangements and also in bilateral contact, then we've had probably quite a lot of contact with Scottish Government counterparts, and there's quite a wide range of areas of common interest.
Thank you. Can I just, at PermSec level, are you having a similar experience as well?
Yes, across the whole of the Welsh Government, we're putting a lot of energy and, frankly, scarce resources into engaging constructively. There are sort of 4 sets of engagement. First, my own, there is a monthly meeting of devolved administration PermSecs with DEXU. I always attend that with key staff. I have a weekly one-to-one meeting with Philip Rycroft, the head of DEXU, and of course there's Jeremy Hayward's weekly meeting of all PermSecs. The second big block is the EU transition team, represented here by Piers. They engage directly with DEXU and Cabinet Office on policy, strategic and constitutional matters. They have been responsible for producing policy papers that set out the Welsh Government position, which have been very well received, and I think there's general acknowledgement that they are strongly evidence-based, so they've had, I believe, quite a lot of impact. Third block of activity is individual Welsh Government departments. Brexit policy and sort of operational impact has been mainstreamed across the Welsh Government, and individual officials from each department have very regular direct contact with their counterparts in UK Government, and it's they who've been taking part in these deep dives. And finally, fourth block I'd mention is our small Brussels office, where the staff obviously have regular engagement with UCREP colleagues. On the quality of engagement, I'd say it has been severely constrained by limited transparency on detail, but it's been very positive in certain areas. I'd highlight the development of UK frameworks, the formal agreement on principles for frameworks. I think that was a big step forward. We hope very much that that shows that we will engage very constructively and build trust.
Thank you very much indeed. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
David Jones.
Morning, First Minister. I understand that the Welsh Government has submitted a continuity bill to the presiding officer. Could you explain the purpose of the bill and how it's proposed it would work?
Well, there are 2 objectives to the bill. First of all, to ensure that the law continues to function, of course, following the UK's withdrawal from the EU, but secondly, to ensure that it's the Assembly and Welsh ministers who are responsible for taking the necessary legislative steps in relation to EU law in Wales where those steps apply to devolved matters. Now, just to be clear, that is not our preferred way forward. We would prefer to be in a position where there are agreed amendments to the laws that protect the devolution settlement, but of course the continuity bill is something that we have to hold in reserve if that situation doesn't arise.
Could you explain how the bill would work in practice?
Yes, it would, as I've said, what it would do is it would ensure that the EU law, as it currently applies, will continue to apply, but it would also ensure that where powers return in devolved areas from Brussels, that they return here. That is a step we have to take in order to preserve the devolution settlement. But as I said earlier on, that is not a preferred option. We prefer to be in a position where we have agreed amendments between the governments in the Lords that would then deal with the issue.
Have you shared a draft of the bill with the British government?
No, the bill has been shared with the presiding officer, but of course the presiding officer has not yet made a determination on the bill as to whether it's within competence, and so now would not be the appropriate time to share that bill.
Do you anticipate that such a bill would put you on a collision course constitutionally with the British government?
Collision course, I think, is a strong phrase. It would certainly put us in a very different position, but then we are already What we want to do is get to a position where that is avoided, where we can agree amendments, and we know the Prime Minister herself has said there will be amendments. I want to get to a position where I can recommend a legislative competence consent motion rather to the Assembly, but we're not yet in that position. Certainly isn't the case that we're looking for reasons to try to block the bill. Far from it. We want to get to a position where that LCM can be passed.
Because at the moment, if the bill currently before the Lords proceeds, it would be a piece of legislation that would be, I would have thought, incompatible with the legislation that you're proposing.
Yes, it would. And of course, that leads... Well, we're already in a position where there is disagreement over what should happen with devolved powers when they return from Brussels. The difficulty is this, that as things stand, I would have to stand up in the Assembly and ask the Assembly to approve a situation where powers that would otherwise come to the Assembly should be diverted to Whitehall for an indefinite period. Now, clearly, no UK Prime Minister would do that in the UK Parliament, and there's no way I can do that here as the Chairman has said, the Welsh Parliament. I want to be in a position where I can say to the Assembly, our position is protected, the devolution settlement is protected, therefore there is no reason now why an LCM can't be approved.
How encouraging was your last meeting with the First Secretary of State?
It's good. There are open discussions. There are issues that still need to be resolved, but I think it is possible to get to a position where those issues are resolved. We're not there yet, but we welcome the commitment the UK government has given. But what we don't want to see is a situation where legislative consent is refused both in Wales and Scotland and then overridden at Westminster. That is a position of conflict and not one that I would seek or want to see. I'd rather see this resolved through Lord's amendments.
You acknowledge that the United Kingdom Parliament has the power constitutionally to override any legislation that the Assembly were to bring forward?
Yes, it does, but that would be wholly undemocratic. It's legally correct, of course it is. You have to remember that the devolution settlement here was approved not by one, but by two referendums. And the people in Wales in 2011 gave their very strong support for primary powers to come to this place without the restrictions that are there in the current EU withdrawal bill. So it's hugely important that the democratic mandates of previous referendums are respected in the same way as the mandate in the BrExit referendum should be respected.
Of course, the Government of Wales Act does reserve the competence to the United Kingdom Parliament. Isn't there inherently the seed of constitutional conflict as a consequence of what you're proposing?
Not at all. Our argument is this, that at the moment, if we look at agriculture, everything pretty much is either controlled from Brussels or from Cardiff. There is no involvement, or very little involvement from Whitehall. This would mean that a situation where powers that would naturally flow constitutionally back here to the people of Wales would be prevented from doing so. That is a recipe for conflict and one that we should seek to avoid. There's also an inherent conflict in some areas that are not resolved without agreement. I'll give one example. Fisheries quotas are allocated, of course, at European level. We would be in a situation potentially where DEFRA would allocate the fishing quotas to the 4 nations of the UK, but DEFRA is also the English department. So how could we have confidence that DEFRA wouldn't skew the quotas in order to help England? I'm not saying that's what they would do, but certainly that's an inherent conflict that needs to be resolved. The way to resolve that is to be in a position where issues such as quotas, such as the distribution of agricultural subsidies, those issues are discussed and agreed between administrations. I think that helps to avoid conflict and to ensure the UK remains in harmony.
I think we'll be discussing issues such as that later in this session. So
can I just pick up on one thing? I mean, I think the expectation is that DEFRA becomes something of a UK department, because obviously it takes on responsibilities for the whole of the UK. And the question is how we provide assurance and make sure Wales has a voice in the way that department exercises its functions.
There's an inherent conflict because DEFRA is also the English department in agriculture and in fisheries. It would have to resolve...
The Home Office has some UK responsibilities, anti-terrorism, for example, which are not necessarily... But it's very much an English department, isn't it? I mean, it
No,
is
it's not.
possible to
It's an
square the
England and Wales
circle, isn't
department.
it? Sorry?
It's an England and Wales department, the Home Office, pretty much. But as far as, if we look at devolved areas such as agriculture, such as fisheries, the UK pretty much doesn't exist. Everything is either devolved or it's run at European level. How do we then get to a position where we resolve the inherent conflict that exists, where a department in Whitehall is both the British department and the English department? How can there be reassurance, for example, that there will be fair dealing in terms of quotas? We don't know, for example, how agricultural subsidies will be
very clear.
divvied. So that's the difficulty.
David, you finished? Rupa Huq. Oh, Paul.
Isn't the greatest danger to Wales the collision that's likely to take place, is taking place, between two wings of the government at the moment, and the lack of clarity stems from that, of whether we're going to get a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit? And isn't it true that when Michael Gove spoke at Oxford, he did mention Wales? Well, he mentioned the Archers frequently in his speech, and he mentioned the continuation of subsidies in England. I mean, do you think the Fitz-all United Kingdom recipe was given for agriculture is going to lead to anything but disaster for Welsh agriculture if we're exposed to international competition?
Well, there is a need for there to be an agreed set of rules across the UK in order to preserve the UK's internal single market. We know that. And that is an objective we share with the UK government. The difference is that we see the current withdrawal bill as imposing those rules, whereas we believe those rules should be agreed. And so that inherent conflict has not been resolved. And it's hugely important that we move to a consensual model as far as the UK is concerned. Agricultural subsidies are a case in point. At the moment, we receive something like £260 million in subsidies from the European pot. The question then is, what happens to them? We don't know. Now, the easiest solution is for the UK government to set aside an equivalent sum of money to what the UK gets now, and for that money to be distributed in the way in the way that it is now. So in other words, we end up with the same amount of money, and that should remain until there's agreement as to how that might change in the future. Otherwise, we end up in a situation where there's a great danger that money will be distributed via Barnet, in which case we get an enormous cut of something between 2/3 and 3/4 of the agricultural budget in Wales. And that's not yet been resolved either. To me, agricultural funding will have to be held in a separate pot and dealt with in a different way. And I think farmers wouldn't want to see a situation where health and education is competing for money that will otherwise go to farming. But these issues need to be resolved, and then the mechanism needs to be in place to ensure that when and if there needs to be a change in that funding allocation, that it's agreed.
What would be the effect on the Welsh steel industry if it's exposed to full competition with China?
It would suffer very greatly. I am not a believer in free trade agreements being the panacea for everything. There is merit in having a free trade agreement with an economy that has a similar income level as your own, because the temptation isn't then there for jobs to move into the economy with cheaper wage rates. However, a free trade agreement with China that allowed the flow of Chinese steel into Wales would destroy the Welsh steel industry.
But you accept that the DIT is a UK department?
I do, and trade is reserved. It doesn't mean we don't have a view. And in a similar way, a trade deal with New Zealand, small economy, if that led to a greater amount of New Zealand lamb coming in, that would also badly affect the Welsh agricultural industry.
How could we conduct free trade agreements as the United Kingdom with other countries without agriculture being in the mix?
Then we must accept that our agricultural industry will be decimated.
No. That's assuming that certain. I'm not assuming. That's making an assumption that we throw open the doors. I don't think that will happen. But I mean, the agriculture is usually a crucial component of a free trade deal. How would you imagine that Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland would be engaged in agreeing or being involved with the construction of such trade deals?
Through consultation. I don't argue that we should have a veto on
Right.
trade deals. It's a reserved area, that's fine. But I think it's hugely important that there should be consultation, because there are some nations and regions in the UK that would be adversely affected, particularly adversely affected by trade deals with certain economies and certain countries.
Yeah, David Jones?
Just briefly, First Minister, you've indicated that you're not wholly averse to free trade agreements with suitable countries. Which countries would you regard as suitable?
The European single market
And
would be the
apart from
first one.
that?
No, that can't be ignored. The European single market is a market where 60% of our exports go, where 90% of our food and drink exports go, which we already
take
have
that as right. He was
alignment.
asking about
No,
other
I was
countries.
asking about other
Well,
economies.
I don't believe that it's possible to have a free trade agreement that works unless we have an agreement with our closest, most important market.
Yes, I appreciate that, but you've indicated that you're not wholly averse to free trade agreements with suitable economies. Are you saying that, therefore, you only regard the European Union as the suitable economy with which we should have a free trade relationship?
Not at all. I would be more than happy to see free trade relationships with other countries that didn't adversely affect the economy of Wales or the UK.
Could you give me examples, please?
Well, much of it depends on what the agreement might look like, of course. I mean, the US is a market, of course, that people would want to see barriers removed from. That's one market. People talk of India and China. Tread carefully, because of the great difference in income levels. I think that's hugely important. But I do not believe that the UK is in any position to agree a free trade agreement with any other economy or country unless it can get right the situation with its biggest, most important market.
So you've indicated you'd rule out New Zealand. What about Australia, Canada?
Fine, but they're no replacement for Europe. They're very small
Rupa
economies
Huq.
compared to the European Union.
To come back again to the continuity bill, as far as we were told yesterday night, we've already had meetings yesterday, it's more of a race than a collision course, that it has to clear its stages here before the EU withdrawal bill. So just what I wanted to ask is, I think you've said that your government doesn't want a continuity bill. Ideally, the UK government should amend the EU withdrawal bill. What do you think of the amendments that are down? Have you seen those? Would any of those do it for you?
They're not yet sufficient. At the heart of this is Clause 11. It's not exclusively Clause 11, but there has to be a series of amendments that are agreed on Clause 11 that can give us the comfort that we need. We're not there yet.
What specifically do you want the amendments to achieve?
What would be on the
Well,
face of
for
the
example, what the amendments do is effectively impose a reserved powers model, a conferred powers model with regard to European issues and European powers. It inverts the devolution model that Scotland already has and Wales soon will have. What we suggest is, instead of having a model that says European issues are reserved to the UK government except those issues that are specifically devolved, invert it. Say all the European issues are specifically devolved except where certain issues are reserved. I think that preserves the devolution settlements. There's a question then as to what should be reserved, but we know that there will be some areas where there will need to be a common agreement within the UK. I think the concern is the UK government take the view that somehow if we have these powers, we will immediately try and do something that will jeopardise the internal market of the UK. Why would we do that? I'm somebody who has consistently and strongly argued for us to be participants in the single market. I can hardly then argue that we shouldn't do the same for the UK's internal single market. So what we have said is, let the powers come to rest where they should. Agreement should be in place not to use those powers until such time as we have agreement to do it across the whole of the UK.
So I think that's actually answered that. So that's what you'd like to see on the face of the bill. Then you could recommend legislative consent.
And would you be happy with a situation where, of course, in the European Union, without any treaty changes, as things develop, there tends to be more and more competencies drawn into the European Union from the member states, so that if an international agreement is made, for example, whatever is in the competence of that agreement automatically becomes an exclusive competence of the European Union. Would you be happy that, under your proposal, that would in fact be potential for powers to slide back up to the UK level on the same basis as they do in the European Union?
Only where there's agreement, and only to my mind where there's a need to protect the integrity of the UK's own internal single market. But the key is that this is done by agreement and not by what we would see as imposition.
But that would give Wales a veto over, say, an international agreement, an international trade agreement, like Wallonia has an international, nearly vetoed the CETA deal. You'd want Wales to be in the same position.
No, I've said before, I don't see a veto as something that we would want to.
Right. But you say, but there would have to be agreement.
Consultation.
If agreement is required, then you've got a veto.
No, consultation is the word I've used.
Right, consultation, right. Okay, I think this is very reasonable and this is very helpful. Thank you very much. Moving on.
Can I just ask, I mean, basically what you're asking for is a seat at the table with the rest of the governments of the United Kingdom, and to ensure that whatever we arrive at is in the best interests of the whole of the United Kingdom, including Wales.
Yes.
It's not really rocket science, is it?
No, I entirely agree.
Okay, thank you.
Ronnie, Cowan.
Thanks very much. I'm worried and I'm wondering what the contact is between the civil service and the Welsh Government and the UK Government, not just the frequency of that contact, but the quality of it and how productive it's been. And I'm also curious, are you playing out scenarios there behind closed doors that say if the Welsh Government gets control of, for example, agriculture, that's what we can then do with it? Or is that off the table until the politicians get their act together?
I'd say the engagement so far is constructive, but it's still at an early stage, still quite high level. We've been going through these deep dives that you'll have heard about. There's been one on agriculture, and we're expecting more to follow. But at this stage, they're really just kind of looking at the broad scope for each subject. And identifying where we can cooperate, as well as looking at where there might be a need for underpinning legislation. So I think the process has been constructive so far, but it is still at an early stage. And of course, we need to resolve the situation on the EU Withdrawal Bill, which cuts across the devolved settlements.
But that's what I'm wondering. But if we wait for politicians to sort this out, and I've lost count, we're 470, 460 days away from Brexit now. We've already wasted 580, 590. So politicians so far haven't actually done their job. Is the civil service looking at this and saying, look, planning ahead post-EU, this is the possibilities for what we could do if we're given that power?
Definitely. That's what my staff spend a lot of time doing.
Thank you.
And I spend a lot of time doing that. I mentioned the direct contacts I have when I'm up in London. We have put a huge amount of energy into this, preparing for different situations. There are areas that concern us more than others. Obviously, issues like agriculture, fisheries, environment have required a great deal of resource. But there is a huge effort going on to make sure that colleagues across the whole of government understand Welsh interests.
But no, I'm not quite sure if you answered my question there. Maybe I missed it. Going into the Brexit election, the EU actual referendum, we had a very vague idea of what Brexit actually meant. Are we now in a situation where we've got a better understanding of what Brexit means, and have we played out scenarios to say, if we got all of agriculture, if we got all of fishing, that's what we could do with it?
I think the difficulty is that the referendum in 2016 asked people to vote for a concept. Yep. And people have interpreted that result according to their own beliefs. Some will argue that it's a vote to leave the customs union for hard Brexit, others disagree. There's no evidence either way as to what people voted for. When we had our referendums here, people could, if they wished, look at a document that explained what would happen as a consequence of how they voted. And that's part of the difficulty here, and it's difficulty for all parties, how do you interpret a vote for a concept in a way that you believe will get the support of most of the people? Discuss. I mean, nobody can possibly know the answer to that question. In terms of what thought have we given to what we might do with agriculture and fisheries, it all depends on the financial settlement, of course. It's one thing to have the powers, it's another thing to have the money. Now, from our perspective, there are differences in agricultural policy between the different nations of the UK. There need to be. Agriculture is different in the different countries. And that's worked very well. But of course, there has to be a set of rules within which everybody operates. One of the areas which is not yet resolved to my mind is if we get to a situation where the UK is no longer bound by EU state aid rules, what are the rules? There are no rules. Now, I don't want to be in a position where there are no state aid rules in the UK. Attractive though it might be to say, wouldn't it be marvellous to do, to throw money at Bristol to attract jobs from Bristol? Actually, the biggest wins in that situation. So there have to be rules in place. The next question then is, who makes the rules? How are they agreed and how are they policed? Because clearly we need to have a body that would police the rules. To my mind, it would need to be a court, the same way as the European Single Market and indeed an EFTA. The Supreme Court could do it. But there has to be an independent adjudicator of those rules that's independent of all governments.
And the bad news is there's 417 days left until
Okay,
Brexit.
I've made the point.
Yes.
Shut me down.
What's time is short.
Kelvin Hopkins?
I think it's one for Cheryl Morgan again. You touched on some areas where I think the phrase is deep dive work has been done, particularly agriculture. And if I think agriculture, I'd like to talk about that a bit further because First Minister, you suggested that free trade wasn't the panacea. Would it not be wise to go even further than that, say actually agriculture is an area where protectionism would be right? Norway protects their agriculture very strongly indeed, and without protection it would just die. And one of the reasons why the Norwegians are so strongly in favour of that degree of independence is because they can protect their agriculture and indeed their fishing. So that's one question, and if I can build another one into that.
First.
Okay.
I don't know of a single economy or country that does not try to protect agriculture because of the emotional attachment that people have to the land, even though they may live in cities. And I don't know of a single country or a single free trade agreement where a country has volunteered the death of its agricultural industry in order to achieve that agreement.
Indeed. When we're out of the CAP and we can reallocate our agricultural subsidies, is it not possible that we could allocate it away from those very wealthy large farmers, mostly in England, Duke of Devonshire, for example, and spend a bit more on supporting, sustaining Welsh hill farming and sheep? That would be a sensible thing to do, would it not?
Well, we do it already to an extent. Our system here is very, very different. There are two things I think we need to guard against. Firstly, any attempt to skew the market against certain goods, which is why we need rules, which is why we need state aid rules. We wouldn't want a situation, for example, where one country decided to over-subsidise its produce to make that produce cheaper within the UK at everyone else's expense, and that's something we need to guard against. And secondly, of course, ensuring the ability of farmers to be able to move goods around the UK. England is a very big market for us, of course it is, and we need to ensure that market, that access to the market of the UK is as unfettered as it is now.
Yeah. One thing, again, it occurs to me that we could subsidise our own agriculture for strategic reasons, for cultural reasons, for all sorts of reasons. But we could also buy some of the cheap surpluses from what remain from the EU, because they are sometimes selling off surpluses at knockdown prices outside their own market. Not to the advantage, I say, of some African countries, but we could buy some of that and do very well out of it.
I'm not sure that happens now. It certainly used to happen, but the issue of overproduction has been dealt with. I mean, certainly at one point, farmers were paid to produce as much as possible, which is why we had all the glut that we have. And the Welsh sheep flock was far bigger than it should have been. But a quarter of the production, I'd say, wasn't needed. Now we have a far more market-focused sector in Welsh, in, for example, sheep meat. It's the same in beef, same in dairy than was the case before. So, yes, from my perspective, agricultural payments are there not just as an economic payment, but they're a social and cultural payment as well. Effectively, farmers receive the money and they act as a conduit for that money to be spent in and around the community. So that they're a rural subsidy, in effect, that happens to have farmers as the conduit.
Thank you. David Jones?
Yes, First Minister, there's been quite a bit of discussion historically about the issue of whether there should be a separate Welsh jurisdiction. Of course, it's currently part of the conjoined England and Wales jurisdiction. Do you foresee that the departure of Wales from the European Union with the rest of the UK is likely to have any impact upon that particular argument in the future?
No, I don't.
Thank you.
I think this is an issue that's separate from Brexit.
Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on. Cheryl Gillan.
Yeah, I've looked at your proposals for a UK Council of Ministers. Would you care to explain them for the committee's benefit?
Yes, instead of having the JMC, which is working better than it was, but you'll know yourself, JMC plenary was basically a forum where people came and complained at each other. Didn't have any particular use beyond that, which I regret.
Oh,
I think there's a huge...
we did get the transport stuff barnetised from the Olympics.
We did. After that was a hangover, of course, from different governments. But yes, we did do that, but it was rare. I mean, you know yourself, it wasn't a particularly constructive structure, and I think we have an opportunity to have something more constructive now. A Council of Ministers where we can deal with issues such as agriculture, such as fisheries, on a common UK basis and come to agreements. Now there is a precedent for this. This is not as extraordinary as it may sound. When I was, many years ago, when I was Secretary for Agriculture and Rural Development, as the title had it then, every month the 4 ministers would meet in London and we would agree the position for the coming European Council of Ministers meeting, and it worked very well. So there is a precedent there for it, and we were from different parties. It wasn't something that was done. That could be done despite those differences. If it was good enough then, to my mind, it's good enough now, and it can be expanded now to a situation where these issues can be discussed and agreed.
Can I bring you Sandy? Sandy Martin?
You talk about how it worked when there was agreement, but how would it work when there was not agreement? I mean, it's very difficult to see how a Council of Ministers, where you have 3 ministers representing 15% of the population and 1 minister representing 85% of the population, would be able to disagree without one party overriding the other 3 parties.
Well, we have suggested a voting system that will overcome that, recognising the size of England. So, for example, you might say it's England plus 1. You know, these are not views we've canvassed with the Scottish Government in terms of getting their agreement, but then I think there are ways around this in terms of having a voting system that recognises the size of England. Would it be right to have a situation where the sheer size of England is ignored? No, it wouldn't be. But there are ways around that.
But surely there's a constitutional anomaly here, because ultimately the UK Parliament is sovereign, and that's part of the reasons we're leaving the European Union. So isn't there always going to be some sort of conflict between the structure that you're proposing, unless there are further agreements between the 4 nations?
I am unconvinced that the sovereignty of the UK Parliament is the way forward. Now, is this as radical as it seems? Does it mean it's a federalism? No, because the English question is the big question. What do you do with a country that's so large? But Canada has a system of pool sovereignty, and it works very well, and it's a very stable country. I think in reality, despite the fact that the legal situation is that Parliament can override anything, politically it would be very difficult to do that. And in fairness, no attempt has been made to do that over the past 19 years in any event. Now, do we have to move to that model in order for a Council of Ministers to work? No. It's not essential. I think a Council of Ministers could work just as well in terms of establishing conventions that would then be followed.
I mean, that was essentially what we were trying to do with the Cabinet Subcommittee that had a minister in each department that was responsible for liaising, so that there was some sort of coordination back in the days when I was occupying a seat. But for me, it's quite a tricky thing to really to give birth to, because it's almost got to be, we've got to get the ministers together and show that it works before anybody will accept a formalisation of the structures that you're proposing.
I see no reason why it can't work. It works at European level, it works in other countries. There's no reason why it can't work. And it did work very well, of course, after the example that I've in terms of the example I've just given.
Yeah. What about the other areas of devolution in England? Because, of course, now we've got huge powers going to London and to Manchester and to other areas. I mean, have you thought how that would figure?
Well, that would be a matter for us, but we, of course, have the city deals. We're looking at how we can create a similar structure in the northeast of Wales, working with the Northern Powerhouse, economically, of course. Political borders don't follow economic reality. We know that. So there is a case for devolving powers further to the appropriate structures. It's making sure those structures are the right structures in order for those powers to be devolved.
And how would you envisage the scrutiny of it? I mean, I'm delighted we're having this meeting because I think this is really constructive and it's the initiative of our chairman here. And how would you see parliamentary scrutiny, whether it's Welsh or Scottish or Westminster?
That's the issue that we're wrestling with at the moment. What kind of structure could be put in place that's sufficiently accountable both to local electors and, of course, accountable to the Assembly itself? But you know, I don't believe that's something that should hold us back in terms of looking at how we can create regional hubs within Wales.
Have you got active work going on that at the moment?
Is
there anything you can share with us as a
Well, that work is ongoing. I'll ask the Cabinet Secretary to write with further information on that.
But do you envisage scrutiny to be a joint enterprise between the United Kingdom Parliament and the Welsh Assembly, or would it be...
No, these are devolved matters.
Right, okay. Even where JMC is dealing with joint frameworks, for example?
I don't think this would be an issue that we would call up in joint frameworks. I mean, these are issues that are wholly within devolved areas. There are issues for each separate government.
Can I just press, would you not see, for example, a committee such as this having MPs sitting alongside MSPs and Assembly members, which is what I had in my mind's eye? And the point is we're all elected representatives, we've all got a common interest, and we're accountable to our individual parliaments and our electorates, but surely there must be something where we can sit MSPs, AMs, MPs alongside each other to scrutinise.
Scrutinise what, though?
How the intergovernmental bodies go, the Council of Ministers.
Oh, I see,
operate.
Right.
Sorry.
Well, in theory, I don't see a problem with that. That would be a matter, of course, for the legislatures to resolve.
But there should really be no barrier. I mean, we're all elected representatives and we've all got a common interest. It would be quite an interesting concept.
In terms of the different parliaments scrutinising the work of the different governments where those governments are involved in intergovernmental machinery, well, in theory, I can't see why that would be a difficulty.
Okay. David Jones?
Just pursuing that last point further, you mentioned the Northern Powerhouse, which of course is of great interest to members of Parliament and Assembly members from North Wales. Would you agree that the absence of cross-border structures is actually holding back both North Wales and the northwest of England in terms of maximising the benefit of the Northern Powerhouse initiative?
Well, we have the Mersey-D Alliance, of course, that's
but that's an ad hoc arrangement,
initiative.
Isn't it?
Sorry?
That's an ad hoc arrangement.
It is. Well, there is no reason, in theory, why there cannot be a structure put in place to enable cross-border cooperation. It happens everywhere else in Europe, so there's no reason why it shouldn't happen here.
Because I remember that Elizabeth Hayward a few years ago actually proposed such cross-border structures. Is that something that you personally would support?
In theory, yes. We have to see how those structures would work. Who, for example, would represent the English side? It's easier in Wales, but it's more difficult then in terms of working out who would represent England. Would it be local authorities? Would there be an input from UK government? These are issues that would need to be resolved, but they're not beyond resolution.
And would your administration be supportive of the notion of devolving competence to a North Wales entity in order to participate in these cross-border structures?
Well, given the right structure, it is something that we would be prepared to look at.
Thank you for that. The Welsh Assembly Government has argued that it now has a legitimate interest in a range of reserved policy areas that impact upon Wales. You've suggested that intergovernment institutions should be extended to other areas which are not necessarily within the devolved competence of the Assembly. What areas would you envisage these to be?
Well, trade is one area. I think it's important to have, as Cheryl Gillan has put it, a seat at the table in order to make sure that the interests of Wales are represented as part of those discussions. As I say, we don't seek a veto, but we do seek consultation.
And are there any other areas apart from trade where you feel that it would be helpful?
I think this is ongoing work. We have to see what kind of Brexit we end up with next year and the years beyond that in order to see whether there's a need for more consultation. I can't see that there will be any objection from the UK government to putting in place a system of consultation in areas that are reserved.
Thank you.
Kelvin Hopkins.
Done to build and develop trust and mutual respect between the governments and legislators in the United Kingdom? And are there models elsewhere that might be useful to look at?
The UK is unique in the sense that it's not a unitary state. It's not federal either. It sits somewhere between the two. In terms of relations between the legislatures, those relationships are not, as somebody who sits in government, they're not as strong as they might be. In terms of the relationships between governments, it is a Council of Ministers, and that kind of structure that would certainly help in terms of facilitating that. I mean, I've experienced the British Irish Council and the JMC. The British Irish Council is a forum. It doesn't do much beyond that. And the JMC has been a forum where much could have been done with it, but it tends to be, as I say, a sounding board for complaints. And I think we could go well beyond that and set up a structure where there is genuine discussion and genuine agreement on the way forward across the UK.
Have things been improving a bit in recent years, particularly since the 2011 referendum and more power going to the Welsh Assembly and so on? Does that mean a bit more respect?
I think what's missing is a proper trilateral, and we hope quadrilateral in time with Northern Ireland, structure where these discussions can take place. JMC plenary meets once a year. That clearly isn't enough. Yes, it's true to say that there are other committees of the JMC that meet more frequently, but in reality, I sit down with the Prime Minister, First Minister of Scotland, and in the past the First Minister and Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland once a year. I don't think that's enough. We need to make sure that the meetings are more frequent than that.
You don't have the tensions, perhaps Scotland with the SNP, my colleague Ronnie Cowan here, and Northern Ireland for obvious other reasons. There are problems, in a sense, more tensions there than there are between Wales and England and Wales and the United Kingdom. Is that fair?
That's the sort of tensions you mean?
Well, Scotland, many people in Scotland still want to be independent, and there's the governing party is an independent party.
That's not a factor in Welsh politics.
You don't have that.
No.
Quite.
Rupa Huq?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, as a fellow Labour comrade, where kind of the party or party relations in general fit into all these different hierarchies and structures. So, yeah, relationships on intergovernmental relations and how sort of party politics fit into these.
Oh, well, the relationship is very good with both Jeremy Corbyn and Keir Starmer.
And do you take do you sort of meet with them regularly in the same way that you do with the First Secretary, that kind of thing?
More regularly.
More regularly, good. And are there sort of tensions within the Labour Party, because our party has different wings as well, and also Wales, different bits of it voted differently?
There are no tensions within the Labour Party at all. There are different viewpoints.
Get round to me to ask
there are different viewpoints, of course. There are. The thing about Brexit is that party lines become very blurred, to my mind, in terms of people's approaches to what the UK should do once it leaves the EU. My view is we should be in the customs union. And full and unfettered access to the single market. You can debate whether you can be a member of a market or not. I don't think it matters. If you're a business, all you want to know is you can export without a barrier.
Maybe say that louder to our leader, because sometimes he seems to think that. Anyway.
Well, I think it's important to react to events as they develop.
Sorry. Okay.
Sandy Martin.
Yes, I think we've moved swiftly on from that. First Minister, you've got overwhelming support in Wales for the additional devolution powers that are coming to Wales at the moment, but do you believe that there's further that you should go? I mean, presumably the Plaid members in Wales want full independence, otherwise they wouldn't still be running as a separate party. So, I mean, where would you draw the line between your view of how much devolutionary power Wales should have and full independence?
I think there's one major unresolved issue, and that's justice. Mm-hmm. And that's the unresolved issue. Beyond that, there are very few other issues. I think there are issues then of how the structure works and intergovernmental relations, but we have this odd scenario of interest to lawyers perhaps, but people are not exactly marching in the streets about it. I accept that. This is the only common law jurisdiction anywhere in the world where there are two legislatures in it. And it makes no sense from a legal perspective. You know, people, those who choose to look at these things, can't understand why it is that, for example, an Act of Parliament might say this changes the law of England or Wales, but it only applies in England. And you know, people have had experience of people producing an Act of Parliament only to be told that doesn't apply in Wales, even though the title suggests it does, which is clunky. Secondly, of course, there's a challenge for the legal profession. I'm told by judges that counsel turned up in courts in Wales and argued the wrong law because they assume because it's the same jurisdiction, the law must be the same. Now, one of the challenges we do face is how we disseminate Welsh law to the legal profession. Where do they find out what it is and what it is? That's true. But it's an odd scenario from a legal perspective that you have, you know, usually you have one parliament, one jurisdiction. And the only place where it happens, where this doesn't happen, is here.
And would you say that your tax-raising powers and your are sufficient, or do you still feel that there are certain things that you would like to be able to do in Wales which are being hampered by the UK Parliament?
I think tax-varying powers, rather than raising, is the word that I like to use. It tends to set hairs running. No, I mean, we welcome the tax-varying powers that we've had. There are still some outstanding issues. Air passenger duty is a particularly sore issue for us. It's devolved in Scotland, and it isn't devolved in Wales. And no reason's been given for this at all. So that is it's a running sore, air passenger duty. We could do it a lot with our airports, plural, if that was devolved. But in general, the test will be how the UK government deals with requests from Welsh government for new taxes. You know, to me, the consideration that the only consideration the UK government should apply is, will this affect other parts of the UK? Yeah. Adversely, I would argue. Not how are we going to use it. That's a different issue. So I think generally in terms of the financial, I mean, Barnett's another issue. I mean, we don't support Barnett. We think Barnett is out of date. Our Scottish colleagues would take an entirely different view. I understand that, but we're not supportive of Barnett in its current form. But in terms of the taxation powers that we have, they're substantial. They need to bed in. We have a revenue authority, of course, that's been set up, and I think what is absolutely essential is that we can bed in the new powers. We are making changes in terms of land transaction tax, stamp duties it is at the moment, but certainly no plans for a widespread overhaul of the way in which taxes are collected, or indeed the tax rates.
Thank you. Paul Flynn, finally.
What's the value of your government's contracts with Carillion?
Sean? Take it out.
They're not a significant provider of services in Wales. They do feature in one of the bids to run the rail services in Wales and the borders from October 2018, and to take forward some key aspects of the next stage of Metro. and the relevant bidding organisation is currently looking at ways in which it can legitimately remain in that process. They are, Carillion that is, currently the Welsh Government's appointed contractor for the delivery of the design of the A40 Llandewi Felfrey to Penblowin road scheme, the design of that road scheme. We're exploring all the options as to how best to progress to the next stages of the project so as to minimise any delays. They are also the Welsh Government's appointed contractor for the design of improvements to junctions 15 and 16 of the A55. Their profit warning in July 2017 was released after the receipt and assessment of Carillion's bid for that project, but prior to the formal award of the contract. So as soon as Carillion's profit warning appeared in the press in July 2017, we paused our procurement process so as to allow investigations to be carried out on Carillion's financial stability. As a result, the Welsh Government, on balance, could not legitimately withhold awarding the contract to Carillion. So, as with the A40, we will be exploring all options as to how best to proceed to the next stages of the A55 work. But just to sum up again, Carillion are not a significant provider of services here in Wales.
Mr. Flynn.
I take it from there that it's there's a smaller proportion than there was in England, and I recall that Rodri Morgan took a view that PFI was instant gratification for politicians, which was bought at the expense of paying 3 times for the cost of projects in expensive borrowing. Is it your view now that of the government that PFI generally was an error that was good for politicians but disastrous for financially for taxpayers?
Well, we're not as exposed. We do have some PFI projects, but they go back a good few years. We're not as exposed as other nations in the UK. We took the view that we would look at conventional borrowing rather than PFI. There is an attraction to politicians of being able to deliver a project now and pay for it later at much higher cost. That's something Rodri resisted, and I have resisted.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Well, First Minister, we're a few minutes over, but it's been brief and very helpful to us, and I hope that we can continue to have these discussions and promote the cooperation between Westminster and Cardiff over the years ahead. Thank you very much indeed for being with us.
Thank you very much, and I hope they do find a way of turning the heating on here for you.
Order, order.
The proceeding is currently suspended.
Second panel this morning here in the Welsh Assembly, where we're taking evidence on interinstitutional relations but within the United Kingdom. And can I ask each of you to identify yourselves for the record, please?
My name's Jane Dodds. I'm the leader of the Welsh Liberal Democrats.
Andrew R.T. Davies, leader of the Welsh Conservatives in the National Assembly.
And we're very concerned to hear this morning that Leanne Wood is unwell and can't be with us, and we send her our very best wishes, and I hope she gets well very quickly. Can I start? And we're going to have to be very brief with our questions and our answers, so I beg you. The whole of the National Assembly for Wales voted in favour of introducing a continuity bill. What were each of your reasons for supporting this?
Well, if I go first then, from the party's point of view here in the National Assembly, we believe that not enough certainty had been given in the negotiations to date around protecting the devolution settlement, and that's why we chose to vote in that particular way. It's wrong to say that it was a major vote, in that I think the vote you're referring to was a backbench members' bill correct me if I'm wrong, introduced by Stephen Lewis. And so we have a presumption as a group that where backbenchers bring forward legislation in this institution, they should have the right to take that forward and add some more meat onto the bone of it. So it was very much at the preliminary stage, but we do as a group have reservations around some of the assurances that have come in the discussions around the devolution settlement.
Right, so very important that this isn't a full-on 100% commitment.
No, it's important to understand the context that vote was given in.
Jane Dodds.
Yes, thank you. As you know, I don't sit in the Welsh Assembly, but from our perspective, we would support the EU Continuity Bill in the Welsh Assembly, and the reason for that really is that it's an insurance kind of position. We're very concerned of the effect of the EU Withdrawal Bill on Wales, and it feels like we need something there just in case.
Sandy Martin.
Yeah, can I just ask Mr. Davis, there's going to be a very short time frame within which such a continuity bill could have any effect. It's going to have to come in pretty quickly if it's going to happen before the withdrawal bill is passed by the UK Parliament. So if you are not 100% happy, and if you think that there may be serious reservations about some aspects of it, do you think there's any likelihood that the continuity bill will actually come into effect before?
Well, let's be clear. I don't particularly want to see a continuity bill coming forward for discussion in this institution. I hope that by a negotiation, an accommodation can be arrived at where, watching your earlier evidence session, and as the First Minister's on record as saying, that he feels in a position to support an LCM of a resolution in this institution. And I hope that we can get to that position. I met David Liddington on Thursday, and I understand obviously from the preparatory work that Damien Green did when he was first Secretary of State, there's been considerable progress along the way to reach that agreement. We're not at that position yet, but I do believe that an agreement will be met.
Can I just ask, was it a handout bill from government that was given to your backbencher? Or was it
it wasn't our backbencher? No, it wasn't our backbencher. Stephen Lewis
the backbencher.
No, it was very much his own proposal. It was. It wasn't the Welsh Government's continuity bill.
Okay, so the Welsh Government came on this later.
Well, I believe the Welsh Government in tandem have been working their own bill up, and they're very clear that they do have their own bill ready to go at the moment. But Stephen Lewis has been promoting this avenue for quite some time. Now, I'm not saying that it's the correct avenue, but as I said, as a group, we have a presumption where a backbencher has the good luck to be drawn on the ballot, that they should be able to take that proposal forward and put some meat on the bone. And I think most people agree that that's a sensible way forward.
I was trying to find which came first, the chicken or the egg. You know what I mean? But it was quite interesting because I presume the backbench bill was introduced because of this tight time frame, which is almost impossible to get it through.
There's a frustration. It's not for me to speak on behalf of, I'm sure if Leanne was here, she'd be able to map it out, but it's not for me to speak on the reasoning why Plaid Cymru as a group and Stephen Lewis chose to do this, but they do believe that there's an urgency that the government haven't addressed in this place around a continuity bill. As I said, I don't particularly want us to get into the territory of a continuity bill. I want us to have an agreement with the UK government that allows an LCM to be passed in this institution and in Edinburgh, because that's the sensible way forward.
Rupa Huq.
Since the days when Tony Blair let slip during one of those early referenda that it will be like a parish council and it won't have any powers at all, devolution in Wales has sort of come on in leaps and bounds, 2 referendums now. Where would you like to see the future of it going?
Do you want to do Jane first?
Yeah, relationship between Wales and the UK.
Yes. It feels like we're very much on the road. We're not at the full devolution yet. There's lots of things that we could be looking at, and from the Liberal Democrat perspective, we want to be thinking about the same powers that are in Scotland being here in Wales as well. So we're very much on the road to devolution in terms of the Liberal Democrat position.
You're quite right. There's 2 former Secretaries of State on this committee, and both worked tirelessly to obviously bring forward new proposals, and the 2 Wales bills that came forward, along with the Silk Commission, which Cheryl in her time as Secretary of State established, cross-party representation on that commission as well, has pushed the institution into completely new territory. I believe that the devolution settlement needs to recognise what the United Kingdom is, which is the most successful cultural, economic and social entity, and I've used this time and time again, the world has seen. And devolution shouldn't be allowed to pick that apart. It should strengthen it. Now, I don't necessarily believe that we should be replicating what Scotland has, because one thing I do recoil from is this argument that for Wales, look to Scotland. That isn't the case at all. Economically, we are far more interlocked with the economies of England than the Scottish economy is, for example. And the last thing I want to do is to create walls that don't need to be created between Wales and England. And so I believe that the Assembly should be now working with the new toolkit that it's got, rather than trying to race on to the next stage impost in devolution, which at the moment seems to sit in 101 different boxes at the moment.
Right. Ronnie Cowan.
Given that in mind, I'm wondering what the impact you foresee of the UK's exit from the EU. What's that going to do to the future governance of Wales?
I think it's going to be very positive. As a Brexiteer, you'd expect me to say that. But I think there's a huge opportunity here to strengthen what we have in the devolution toolkit at the moment. The UK government, for example, well, by working with what we've got already and by working with a strengthened UK model of governance.
What does that mean? With more powers coming to Wales?
Well, if that's what seems to be a sensible model of governance, then yes, that might well be the case. I mean, the UK government is already on record as saying that more powers will come out of our leaving the European Union to the devolved governments and the devolved institutions. But I don't believe it should happen for the sake of it.
Because 11 had the opportunity, they gave nothing. So the words are cheap. So we want to see the action. The question is, when the UK leaves the EU, how are you going to get more governance over Wales through that process?
Well, I believe at the moment what you have is a deference to the Brussels model that actually has stopped a lot of the decision-making here in Cardiff and the ability to push that decision-making out from Cardiff to the regions of Wales. I mean, every time I've been an Assembly member now for 11 years, and the amount of times you get told, can't do it because Brussels says we can't do it. Now we will have an opportunity to influence the decision-making process and actually take some of those decisions ourselves here in Wales. I heard your evidence-gathering session with the First Minister who highlighted hill farming here in Wales, for example. And there used to be a scheme called the Tir Mynydd scheme, which supported hill farmers here in Wales because of the socially challenging environment they worked in. We were told at the time that scheme had to go because Brussels didn't believe it was compatible to the European model of support. So overnight, the Welsh Government withdrew that support. We will be able to craft an agricultural policy, a rural support policy that is fit for Wales and fit for the UK, not necessarily fit for 27, 28 other countries.
If you get the powers back from the UK.
And I'm confident that will happen because the UK government is on record as saying that will happen.
I hope you do. Mm-hmm.
So we're at opposite ends of the spectrum, quite clearly. We've always been the Remain party, very concerned about any powers being taken from Wales. Can see the EU withdrawal bill as actually doing that. One of the concerns I have is whether the second chamber will have time in order to scrutinise properly the EU withdrawal bill, because that is part of our democracy and our position here. We have to see that Wales will get not a penny less from leaving the EU, and that's the Liberal Democrat position.
And Sally Martin, briefly.
For both of you, really, leaving quite aside the matter of money, there is a very strong feeling, and the First Minister mentioned it, about the difference between the British government taking powers from Brussels and then divvying up a few, like crumbs from the table, to the devolved administrations, or alternatively, everything going to the devolved administrations apart from the devolved powers, the reserved powers. I mean, the whole question of reserved powers is a really, it's not about the actual powers, it's about who actually gets to choose what powers you've got and whether or not you have powers as of right, or whether it's just what the British government wants to give you. I mean, do you recognise that that is an issue?
Well, as I understand it, with the powers that are transferring back from Brussels to the UK, they amount to about 64, 65 different areas. That list has been dramatically reduced over time, especially with the negotiations. And as I said, the commitment from the UK government is very much to transfer as much of those responsibilities that are coming back from Brussels to the devolved governments and the devolved legislatures. But one thing I think we all have to be conscious of, and I think all politicians are, is that we don't harm the biggest market of all, which is is the UK single market. And it's linking those two competing dynamics together, the strength of the devolution settlement with the need to preserve the UK single market, and then finding an equation that can balance the votes in those discussions.
I think we can all agree about that, but what I don't think we're necessarily going to be agreed about is whether you think it's sensible that the decision as to which powers come to the devolved governments actually is entirely in the hands of the UK Parliament or UK government.
Well, certainly on paper that's how it should work, because obviously that's how the democratic settlement is. I would hope that they could be arrived at by agreement, but obviously under the Government of Wales Act, the UK Parliament is sovereign, and that can be exercised if it was so the wish of the UK government. I hope we don't get to that position, and we do find an agreement that actually can transfer these responsibilities, which, as I said time and time again, the UK government is on record as saying they want to transfer those responsibilities. This isn't a power grab. I get the language, don't get me wrong, because we're in the field of politics, but this isn't about a power grab.
Okay.
Why didn't Clause 11 go on this stage with no amendments to it? 591 days after Brexit.
I think you must probably understand the way the Houses of Parliament work better than I do. As such, I've been a member of this institution. I would very much hope that progress could be made very quickly on amendments to make sure we can get into the position that we need to be in, as I said, to get a recommendation here, get a recommendation Holyrood that the LCM can pass. And those discussions, as I understand them, are ongoing. As recent as Thursday of last week, there were discussions on this.
I think we know in any political environment, if the will's there, things can happen. If the will's not there, it doesn't.
David Jones.
Yes. The Welsh Government has indicated that it would like to see intergovernmental relations put on a statutory footing. On behalf of both your parties, would you agree with that? And could you also say what specific proposals you would favour?
Yes, I would absolutely agree with that, see that put on a statutory footing. Of course, the context here, and I would agree with Andrew on this, is that we want to see trust built up so that there is the opportunity for people to work on the basis of what's best for the Welsh people. Whilst that occurs, whilst we get to a point where things can be negotiated, then we need to think about mechanisms which make that much healthier. The fact that I understand that the various First Ministers only meet once a year, for example, at the moment, probably isn't enough, and we need that to happen more frequently. We need to have very clear priorities and the opportunity really to talk to each other about what's best, in our case, for the people of Wales.
Priorities would you put first?
Well, of course, agriculture would be the big one, particularly here in Wales. Trade, welfare benefits, looking at how we can get the grants that we had from the EU back into Wales, particularly in those areas that are deprived. I'm sure there are many others as well.
Yes, but those, if I may say so, particularly the grants issue, are relatively small to medium term. If you're putting the whole relationship on a statutory footing, which would you say are the priorities for that new footing?
So the subject areas or the sorry, perhaps I'm not experienced enough to understand that question.
The question was about, as you know, at the moment the arrangements we've got, the JMCs, are relatively informal and frequently honoured more in the breach than the observance. As I understand it, the Welsh Government thinks that these arrangements should be statutory. And I'm just wondering what sort of arrangements you feel should be comprehended in that new statutory arrangement.
The frequency, the way that they're operated, possibly that there would need to be a kind of proportionality to that, given that Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland would be representing fewer people.
Can you explain that proportionality, that point?
Perhaps I haven't used the correct terminology, but my view is, of course, that England and the leaders of England represent far more people than we do have it here in Wales and in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. But an opportunity to look at that and to actually negotiate how that would look, including, our ability to look at things like agriculture as a big issue in that.
And in terms of frequency of meetings, which is a point...
I don't have a view on that, but definitely should be more than annual.
And that's not just for plenary, but for other arrangements that might be put in place?
I don't have a strong view on that, possibly because I don't have the experience in that, but it should certainly be more than annual.
Mr. Davis.
I don't believe that this term English leaders or English government is helpful. To be honest with you, we have a government of the United Kingdom that is constituted in the Parliament of the United Kingdom and relies on members of Parliament to get its business through. Now, obviously, you've had the English votes for English issues legislation that's come through, and an element has crept in to segregate the legislation that passes through the House of Commons. I do believe that there does need to be a complete overhaul of the way governments meet, but importantly, and you touched on it earlier in your evidence gathering session with the First Minister, about the metro mayors and city mayors in England, because they have an important role to play as well in a lot of this decision making that happens post-Brexit. And I do believe that that's been overlooked entirely it certainly doesn't exist in the current framework, because the framework was put in place before the current government's policy of creating metro mayors and city mayors. But it is fair to say the whole landscape needs to change and change in a positive way.
And do you think that that should be a change to a statutory basis, or...?
I'm open-minded, to be honest with you. I'm someone who doesn't particularly like reverting to law all the time. Perhaps it means we're conservative as such, and then I prefer to reach consensus by agreement rather than compunction through the legal system or the legislation that you're using. And I'd hope that politicians recognise that we are going into a landscape that is totally different to what we've worked in for the last 40, 45 years. And this shouldn't be seen as a hurdle. This should be seen as an opportunity to create a more dynamic framework for the cities, the regions, and the countries of the United Kingdom.
So do I infer from your answer that you're not wholly persuaded that we should be moving to a statutory arrangement?
As I said, I'm open-minded on that at the moment.
And what is the position of your group on this?
It's not a discussion we've had, so we haven't formed a group decision, other than we do not believe that the JMC as a vehicle is functioning to the best of its ability at the moment, leave alone once we leave the European Union. And we should look at it as an opportunity to put the structures in place that does reflect what we look at in modern Britain is today. As I said, metro mayors, city mayors, and the devolved governments.
Do you think that there should be interparliamentary scrutiny of intergovernmental relations within the United Kingdom? And if so, what would you propose?
We're here today, and you're a committee of the House of Commons, obviously taking evidence from leaders within this institution and others as well. Then looking at what's going on around the United Kingdom in the different legislatures in a formal setting has to be a good thing, I would suggest. I'd have no fundamental objection to that. I know it's been cited sometimes where different ministers are asked to come and give evidence to this institution, for example, and they say, well, I'm not accountable, so I'm not coming to your evidence gathering session. I think that's regrettable, and I think it's an opportunity missed, because obviously we have shared objectives and shared goals.
So do you think interparliamentary arrangements should be put in place whereby, for example, members of Parliament, MSPs, Assembly members should be sitting on the same committee and conducting interparliamentary scrutiny of the various governments of the United Kingdom?
Well, whether you have joint committees in the way that you've mapped that out, David, as I said, I wouldn't have formed an opinion on that at the moment, but I do think that there's a real issue around how, going forward, we do make decisions when one part of the United Kingdom accounts for, I think I heard the figure, 85% of the population, and other parts of the United Kingdom, the three other parts, if you like, make up the remaining 15%. We've never had to deal with this challenge, and I know people cite other countries and other models around the around the world, but they've evolved into those models. We're going to have to create something from a very historic landscape that we've dealt with for the last 40, 45 years.
And Ms Dodds, in terms of interparliamentary scrutiny, what is the Liberal Democrats' position?
Well, I'm not sure we've looked at this specifically, but I wouldn't disagree totally with what Andrew says. There are emerging complexities which really mean that we should be looking at models that work across the various parliaments and legislatives. So, we have a huge border between England and Wales, and healthcare, for example, is an issue which affects people in Wales across the border into England and vice versa. And we need to think about what models could work to help us to actually work better, to adopt frameworks which deliver better services and better resources for people across both countries, and certainly again with Scotland as well.
And would that extend to interparliamentary scrutiny?
I think I'm open-minded, and I would be very interested in looking at models that could work in that respect.
Thank you.
Cowan Hopkins.
What effect do relationships within your party have on intergovernmental relations? And really, I think I'm addressing Andrew Davis.
I'd like to think we have very good relations, strong relations. Only, as I said, last Thursday I was meeting David Lidington and the Secretary of State Alan Keynes here to discuss, obviously, opportunities that might exist as we go forward. I regularly go up to London along with colleagues. They regularly come down to London, and whenever in Wales, obviously, we have those meetings, and within the party itself, there's a very strong relationship. Two former Secretaries of State sit on this commission, or this committee here. And I pay tribute to Cheryl in particular, who set up the Silk Commission at one of the very first acts, I think it was, that you undertook, Cheryl, that really did set the benchmark for the next 5-6 years of the devolution, should we call it project, concept, whatever you want to, with two Wales Acts emanating out of that agreed political positioning, where all the four parties were represented, the discussions took place. Did everything that everyone wanted come out of that commission? Not necessarily so. But a huge piece of work was undertaken, and a blueprint to take that devolution forward was agreed.
You don't find that the Welsh Conservatives are sort of pushed a bit further away from UK Conservative Party policy or UK Conservative Party politicians to an extent? I mean, I noticed that there was a unanimous vote for the draft continuity bill which you supported.
But as I said, it's worth. I wouldn't read too much into the vote that was taken in the chamber, because it was a backbench vote, and the principle the group has always had. If you look through our record of voting on backbench legislation, we have voted on some weird and wonderful stuff on the principle that if a member is fortunate enough to bring a proposal to the Assembly at its very initial stage, we believe that that member should be entitled to take it forward and flesh it out. Whereas we've seen the government whip exercised to kill off backbench legislation at its infancy. And we just don't think that's a sensible way to develop legislation. I mean, people do have the right in a democracy to take their ideas forward. Do we get pushed to the margins? At 19.5 stone, it's a bit difficult to push me around, it is, to be honest with you, as people will attest. But I do believe that we have a very good relationship. Of course, that relationship comes under tension at some points, because obviously we have points that we want to push, but we make all devolved policy here in Wales, for example, so on health, on education, on agriculture, the environment. I could go on, the 21, 22 competence areas. It is clearly understood that policy-making capacity is here in Wales, and we work with colleagues then to try and influence UK-wide policy on criminal justice, on policing, etc., on defence, which is a big footprint here in Wales, and we enjoy that close relationship.
Thank you.
Paul Flynn.
Could I first of all welcome the Lib Dem representative, because and congratulate the party this morning warmly for adopting a policy I've advocated to every Chancellor of the Exchequer for the last 25 years of charging those who retire and stay in work national insurance payments. But this is an eminently sensible way of raising billions of pounds in a just and pain-free way. I hope there's success with it. And welcome, of course, Mr. Davis. And again, a warm welcome for the fact that you've been ready students and of devolution over the years. As someone who gave evidence to the Kilbrandon report in 1963, it wasn't ever thus, and it's been very good, I think, for Wales and everyone else, the fact that you have shown a flexible policy on devolution and learned to love it at a slow rate, but a very gratifying result for all of us. The question of I sit on the EFRA committee, which has evidence from Michael Gove, who seems to be selling BrExit by pretending to go green. Would you agree he's actually going Welsh by going to impose a a limit on the maximum amount that farmers get in subsidy, because in England 4 out of 5 people who get, sorry, 1 out of every £5 paid in subsidy goes to billionaires or millionaires. And yes, it's the point is interesting, and he's going to insist that subsidies are paid on production rather on ownership of land. If we post-Brexit, what sort of system would you like to see for Wales, and what limit would you like to see on the top farming subsidies that are paid out, knowing our special conditions?
Well, if you could answer that very briefly, because it's not quite on the topic of intergovernmental relations.
Is that to both of us, or is it just...
a sentence each, please.
Yeah, I think the Lib Dems are on course on this.
I have to declare an interest as a recipient of the Common Agricultural Policy here in Wales.
Thank you for that.
I presume that's the committee rules, so I declare that and put that on the record. To me, I think it's going to be a huge opportunity for us to revolutionise the countryside. We have an average age of farmers of 62 in Wales, we do. You don't build a future with an average age of 62. I passionately believe food production needs to be at the heart of any economic and support policy for the countryside. I would say that as a farmer, wouldn't I? But I believe that passionately. The one thing you cannot knock Michael Gove for is putting ideas and policy out there. Actually, and this may be a bit of government bashing here if I may, but sadly we don't have the same policy positions being taken by the Welsh Government, and there is a huge void in that field of discussion at the moment. But to me, food production, food security has to be the heart of rural policy, along with sustainable rural communities and the way you build those communities to keep young people in them. And you can do that via the envelope of cash that comes via national frameworks, and that's why I was so early in the day coming out and talking about national frameworks, and by national I mean UK frameworks. Otherwise we're going to be in a very difficult position.
But,
Jane
Mr. Gove
Dodds,
is already
just a minute. Jane Dodds.
Yeah, very quickly, nothing more to add. We've got differences, but continued access to the single market and unfettered access to the customs union.
I mean, can you explain how it's going to work out in Wales? Mr. Dodds committed himself at the election to giving 150% of the cheque that will come back post-Brexit to the health service. He's also committed himself to continuing paying 40% of that money that's coming back in agricultural subsidies. So he's already spent 190% of the money that's coming back. Could you explain to farmers who are worried at the moment about being exposed to world competition, but with a hard breakfast? We're doing the same. I made the same.
Come on, ask the question, please.
How is it going to work out? What's going to be the percentage of the budget? Because the steel industry are like to be in trouble, others. Post-breakfast,
Mr. Davis.
Brexit for Wales. And
Mr.
what's
Davis.
going to be a maximum?
I have to say I'm not a spokesperson for Michael Gove. I'm sure he can speak for himself. But all I do know is at his Oxford Farming Conference in January, he clearly set a roadmap out of support for agriculture and the rural economy to 2024, which obviously is a mandate beyond the current Parliament. And I think that's a welcomed roadmap. As I've said earlier, the sad thing about the Welsh Government's position is we've had no vision, we've had no view. My view is quite simple. 3 things. It's about food production and food sustainability, the environment and strong rural communities. And if you work within those 3 corridors, you will have a vibrant countryside that has youth at its heart rather than an ageing population and a declining population.
But you heard what the First Minister said. How legitimately can Michael Gove speak for Welsh agriculture under the new arrangements?
Well, Michael Gove also wears the hat of UK Agriculture Minister. He goes to Brussels and negotiates at the moment on behalf of the UK. That has been a position that has been accepted since we've been in the European Union and since devolution came into being. I appreciate people want to play semantics about this, but at the end of the day, there is a willingness and a commitment in every speech that Michael Gove has made to strengthen the rural economy and strengthen spend within the rural economy.
Jane Dodds?
We have severe concerns about agriculture in particular. We want to move forward and get the best deal we can for Welsh farmers. There is severe concerns around what Michael Gove is talking about and offering. We need to do better by our Welsh farmers here in Wales.
Cheryl, moving on now. Moving on now. Cheryl Gillan.
Can I return?
We know your position on this.
No. You've had a very, very long question. Cheryl Gillan. Order! Order! Cheryl Gillan.
Returning to the inquiry. I'd just like to ask some questions about trust, and intergovernmental trust. Ms Dodds, your position is at the moment that you trust Brussels and the Brussels regime more than you trust the UK government. Is that correct?
It's not correct. I think what we want to see is that there's a better relationship across all of the frameworks.
But you would prefer that we stayed with the European Union, and therefore your trust in the Brussels regime is obviously superior to the UK government.
Sorry to interrupt. I would not call it a regime. We're very clear that we want to stay in the EU. We can see the benefits that it brings, not just in terms of resources and services, but we want to recognise the UK government and the EU, and indeed we want to be looking outside of the EU as well. So the Liberal Democrats have always unashamedly been a pro-European internationalist party, and that's our position.
You trust the UK government?
I think there's always issues where we might have differences, but I think we have to work together in relation to leaving Europe.
I'm trying to get to this trust.
Not on everything, no. And obviously they are a different party to us and they have different values. But surely we have to be working together in order to get the best deal for everybody, and certainly the best deal for the people of Wales.
So you're not going to differentiate between the amount of trust that you put in Brussels. You would prefer that the status quo was maintained.
That's correct.
And so your trust is greater in Brussels than it is in the UK.
I'm not sure I would be able to sort of very clearly sort of say that that's the case. I'm very clear.
How could you improve your trust in the UK government?
I think it's about looking at what values we work with, particularly for the people of Wales, looking at devolution, looking at how they can support us in those devolved settlements and those aspects. And I think it's a growing trust.
Where do you think the values, could you specifically identify those values that you feel the UK government doesn't have and that would need to have to gain your trust?
In relation to the position of the government on the single market and coming out of the customs union, that has severe concerns and implications for the people of Wales, particularly those working in agriculture, and that's one area.
Mr Davis, can I ask the same question of you? How is your level of trust? Would you trust the UK government more than you would the Brussels regime?
Yes, I do. I mean, you'd expect me to say that as a Conservative government, but whatever colour government is in Parliament in the UK, I would hope very much that they would bat as hard as possible for the UK. I trust the Welsh government to do the best job possible, but that doesn't mean that I won't stand up in that chamber or sit in these committee rooms, scrutinise them and hold them to account where they're failing. But that shouldn't call into question your ability to trust someone to do the best job they can. It might be the ideology is different, but ultimately I wouldn't say that I don't trust the Welsh government or I don't trust the UK government.
How do we improve this trust and respect between our various governments around the United Kingdom?
Well, I think the one thing that's come out in earlier evidence gathering sessions is about creating this framework for governments to actually interact together on a level playing field, as it were. There's very much a disparity in that interaction at the moment. One thing I constantly hear coming out of Secretaries of State's mouths at the House of Commons when answering questions, etc., is they call them the DAs, the devolved authorities they do. In fact, they're governments at the end of the day. You know, they're written in the bills that set them up. And it's just simple things like that read into the bigger picture and the bigger narrative.
So language is sensitivity to language?
Well, I think if you don't get your language right, how can you hope to get the substance of what you're trying to achieve? And as I said, this coming out of the European Union and the post-Brexit environment offers a huge opportunity for us to create something really special and dynamic here as to the way the UK is governed and the UK operates. And we all accept that there's a journey about passing powers and responsibilities down. That's happened in England by the city and metro mayors. In Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, obviously, it's been the creations of legislatures and governments from that.
I pressed the First Minister on his proposals for a Council of Ministers. And one of the things I do is sit on the Council of Europe, which is elected representatives from national parliaments of 47 countries, and it's older than the EU. Would you see that there was room for a Council of Ministers that was scrutinised by a joint committee of the various governments around the United Kingdom, so AMs could sit alongside MSPs, alongside MPs?
Well, I think this builds on, obviously, the points that David was making a little earlier. And as I said, I'm quite open-minded about that. I accept that the landscape we've got is not robust enough and is not fit for purpose and does need changing. Regrettably, though, when you look at some of the coalition building that goes on here and the inclusiveness that goes in here, it does seem as if very often, if it's not Labour's way, it's not happening. And we get representatives to go and sit on European committees at the moment from this institution. But basically, the First Minister appoints those representatives, and to date, there has never, ever been a Conservative representative to go out and do that. So it's one thing to talk about it, it's another thing to look at the record and see what's been delivered.
But presumably, if we did have a joint committee, as with this committee, we've got representatives from all parties on it, which I think is a healthier way of doing it, because if we're trying to...
I'm not talking about the committees of the Assembly, I'm talking about some external committees that offer real opportunities. And don't forget, the Scrutiny Committee that oversees the spending of European money in Wales, the chair was removed from that because she broke the Labour whip. She's a backbench member, and she, the Cardiff Central Assembly member, and was removed from the chair's role of oversight of European spending here. So when you talk about governance arrangements, when you talk about accountability, you do have to look what's going on in the backyard as well when people are promoting other schemes and think about their record.
Anyway, you think that there are definitely optimistic signs that we could improve the trust and...
without a shadow of a doubt. And language has to be part of that equation. And I just gave you a very, very simple analysis there of, you know, this constant referral to the DAs. So, I mean, DAs, what are people referring to in today's world?
Devolved administration, and I think it's just shorthand. I don't actually think that it's supposed to be...
But it's dismissive.
Yeah, I understand.
It's dismissive. And if you have a government and you have a legislature, which is the Assembly is now, and soon to change to Parliament in its title, and you have the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government, those are the terms that should be used.
No, I agree.
Support your batting for the rural economy and for the national importance of agriculture. Is there something to be learned from perhaps way we supported agriculture before we joined the common market and before we joined the common agricultural policy? We used to sustain agriculture in various ways in those days. Do you think we could learn something from those days?
The 1946 Agricultural Act obviously set in motion a whole raft of support measures that continued up until our membership of the European market and then the common agricultural policy that flowed from that. As I said, my principle has to be about food security and productive agriculture. I've used the figure, the average age of a Welsh farmer today is 62. I have two sons and a nephew who want to come into the agricultural industry. Thankfully, because they're old mans in it, they'll hopefully get a chance to come into the agricultural industry. If you were my father's generation who started with absolutely nothing, you had a chance in that era back in the 50s and 60s. You don't have that today. The Common Agricultural Policy has not benefited Welsh agriculture, and I will happily champion a more reformed, more liberal agricultural policy that ultimately pays for production and public goods so that we can see genuine return to young people coming into our great industry.
Anything to add, Jane Dodds?
Yes, really quickly, I support the principle of CAP. It needs reforming without a doubt, but that means we should be staying with that system.
Well, thank you both very, very much indeed. It's been a brief but helpful other session, and you've given us a great deal to think about. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. The proceeding is currently suspended.
Sounds pretty weird.
Hearing yourself.
Just waiting for Cheryl Gillan. Are we meant to be on Channel 1 then?
Yes, Channel 1. That's the one.
should be preset on channel 1. That's the channel you need.
Mine's not preset on anything. It's not doing anything.
Right.
What do we do?
We will start. Order, order. And may I welcome Alan Jones, Presiding Officer of the Welsh Assembly, to this meeting of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee of the House of Commons. It's a great honour for us to be here as your guest, and we're very grateful to have the opportunity to have these sessions here. And could I ask each of you to identify yourselves for the record, please?
Ellen Jones, felly, a fi.
I am Ellen Jones, the Presiding Officer of the National Assembly for Wales, here representing the Assembly this morning, and a very warm welcome to you to our Parliament.
Mick Attentive, Assembly Member, Chairman of the Constitutional and Legal Affairs Committee.
Manon Antoniazzi, Clerk.
Manon Antoniazzi, Chief Executive and Clerk to the National Assembly.
Well, we've got a few questions to get through very quickly, and we will ask very short questions. If we could keep the answers short as well, we might be able to catch our train at the end of our session. Many of the witnesses to the committee have suggested placing intergovernmental relations on a statutory footing. If this were to happen, what kind of parliamentary oversight do you think would be necessary?
Well, wrth I ni...
Well, as we move towards implementing the decision to exit the European Union, one of the great challenges for the UK Constitution is to ensure that the relations and the work that goes on intergovernmentally between devolved governments and the UK government is accountable, first of all, to the individual parliaments, and also that we, in a way, can look at how that scrutiny happens between parliaments too, and that is a piece of work that hasn't been done in any formal way in the past, and therefore it's a new piece of work that will take a great deal of thought before anything is put in place and before any decisions are made as to whether that should be on a statutory footing. And in that regard, it is very timely that you are taking evidence from us here this morning, as the Constitutional and Legislative Affairs Committee that Mick Attentive chairs has published a report, in fact published it last Friday, on the very issues that you're discussing, and I can see that you have a copy in front of you there. And there is a recommendation contained within the report, and Mick can expand upon this, but there is a recommendation in the report that specifically refers to this point and proposes the idea of having some sort of speakers' conference which would bring together the speakers of the Parliament in order to initiate the discussions on the details as to how and whether we should be providing scrutiny on a parliamentary level on a statutory footing. And if you're happy for me to refer the question to Mick Attentive to talk about the committee's recommendation, I will do so.
Well, our recommendation was very heavily influenced by this committee's recommendation, as well as paragraphs 38 and 39 of your last report, or the November report, which is really that there needs to be a post-Brexit constitutional change and restructuring, and looking at the JMC and the format that would be. I was very interested in the question you placed, though, in terms of where the scrutiny is, because obviously you can't move away from the situation of primary parliamentary scrutiny. But I've been very impressed with the way in which the intra-parliamentary meetings of committees, for example, the one we had on the 18th of January, the way in which those have brought together almost the parliamentary sphere of all those in that areas, looking at the principles and the fundamentals of change that's taking place. And I think that would actually be a very interesting mechanism. I heard the question in the evidence earlier that being suggested maybe the role of this committee. I think the development of the role of the Intra-Parliamentary group is a very interesting one that could be developed, put on a more formal footing, would require perhaps certain standing order changes, but would be a very useful way of actually looking at the principles of the issues that arise, whilst not undermining the primary parliamentary roles.
Who is going to initiate this? How are the 3 or 4 parliaments in the United Kingdom actually going to jointly initiate this kind of work so that we finish up with establishing some permanent machinery?
Well, it's a very good question, and the suggestion that we've come up with is that we think there's a constitutional role for a speakers' conference to actually initiate this, to set the parameters of that debate for all 4 parliaments or assemblies, for the devolved governments and the UK government, and actually to get some constructive discussion on the principles that might underlie such the development of a more formal relationship. The First Minister has spoken, and others have spoken in the past, about the role of the JMC. It's been given all sorts of different potential names, but there is a sort of structure that is required, and a more formal structure, because post-Brexit, there isn't a return to some pre-1972 nirvana. We do need to have an updating of our constitutional structure, and also the capacity to look at the longer-term constitutional change that needs to take place, not just in terms of the devolved governments, but also the changes taking place within England itself.
Can I ask what discussions, Madam Presiding Officer, that you have had with Mr. Speaker Bercow about this sort of thing so far, informally?
Well, hyd yn hyn...
Well, to date, the quadrilateral meetings between the speakers and presiding officers of the United Kingdom do take place. They tend to be relatively informal, discussing all sorts of issues relating to the effective running of Parliament, in addition to constitutional issues. So, although we have discussed some issues related to Brexit, and in our previous meeting before Christmas we did discuss the Withdrawal bill, we haven't discussed formally in any way the issues related to what scrutiny at a parliamentary level should look like, and what joint scrutiny or joint accountability should look like post-Brexit. So given that this recommendation has now been made from one of our committees at this assembly, then it's an issue that I'm very interested in, most certainly, and it's an issue that I would see as being a responsibility of mine, and also through your work perhaps in the Commons. There is a responsibility now to raise these issues formally between speakers and presiding officers of the various parliaments of the UK. There is some urgency in this area now, and therefore I will be taking this issue forward and placing it on the agenda, hopefully, for the next meeting of speakers, which hopefully will start at the beginning of April.
Encouraged by that, and what discussions take place at clerk level? Could I ask the Chief Executive and Clerk that question?
Of course.
Of course, there are various meetings that happen on an official level. I also go to the quadrilateral meetings with the different speakers, and I'm in very close contact with the clerks of the other parliaments, informally and formally, and that is reflected on several other levels. The clerks meet regularly, the lawyers are also in close contact.
Of interparliamentary or joint parliamentary scrutiny. What discussions have you had about that?
As Ellen said, I wouldn't say that the discussion has been very specific and formal on this issue, but we have set the foundation for more formal discussions in future if needs be. We have internally in this Parliament preparing for the additional resources that will be needed for scrutiny and collaboration before and after Brexit, and I think it would be a natural extension of that to discuss that with the other parliaments.
Thank you. David Jones.
Diolch. Bore da, Llywydd.
Thank you. Good morning, Llywydd.
Evidence to this committee, you said any new intergovernmental decision-making arrangements, such as the Council of Ministers proposed by the First Minister of Wales, must be based on clear principles of subsidiarity, parity of esteem and transparency. Could you explain in a bit more detail what you mean by that? And could you also indicate how you feel that could be achieved?
Welcome back to the member. Welcome back to the National Assembly. Now, I believe that those principles are important. They are principles not only important to the relations between governments and ministers and any future Council of Ministers, but they are principles which are important to the parliaments that that Council of Ministers is accountable to. Now, what I believe is important within those principles is that the relations between governments and therefore between the parliaments is a relationship of equality, in which the institutions are equal and which share powers in a Council of Ministers. And I'm sure it's true to say that anticipating a future Council of Ministers as we move forward from the European Withdrawal Bill is easier to imagine because there is a precedent for it than to imagine what exactly the system should be in terms of parliaments working jointly and undertaking joint scrutiny of a Council of Ministers. I think, as Mick Antonev said, I think it's very important to ensure that the first accountability of any government in a Council of Ministers should be to their home parliaments. And then we would need to develop work when accountability is relevant between parliaments too. That would be joint scrutiny. As we've dealt with the work surrounding Brexit, that there is a role not only for governments to discuss this jointly, but also for parliaments in the context of their committees mainly at the moment to be looking at this issue and having oversight of the work that is ongoing as we undertake Brexit.
Any statutory underpinning of the arrangements that you're talking about?
Well, dwi'n credu o ran...
Well, I believe in terms of any statutory underpinning of the interparliamentary work, then I don't believe that I am in a position, and I don't believe anyone else is in a position either, to come to a very specific conclusion on that at the moment, because there's a fair bit of work to be done in imagining what the future structure of that work will be. So it's too early to say that that should be on a statutory basis, and therefore bringing the model together in terms of what, if anything, needs to be put in place at an interparliamentary level is an issue that needs a great deal more thought, and that's why the recommendation made by the Constitutional Legislative Affairs of this Assembly is useful at this point. I think we do now need to generate some momentum. We need a vehicle so that we can discuss these issues, and some sort of speakers' conference could be a means of achieving that over the coming months.
Cheryl Gillan.
Yes, I'm following on from this. I was going to ask you some questions about potential joint working at committee level following your evidence, Clwyd. But I think really what I want to know is, do you think that there is the will from the members of the Welsh Assembly, soon to be the Welsh Parliament here, to sit alongside, for example, members of Parliament to carry out joint scrutiny, perhaps even carry out joint investigations between something like CLAC and PACAC? Do you think that there is a good political will these days to carry out that joint scrutiny and to sit alongside each other?
Well, I think the political will is there if the value of the work can be highlighted for all. What we don't want is any sort of situation where there is duplication of scrutiny and that there isn't a particular value in creating joint committees or having interparliamentary collaboration. And it's very important in putting any regime in place that it adds value rather than duplicating work. And I do think that any politician can be persuaded, if they are adding value to their activities, that there is value in them doing that. Now, Mick and Mick's committee, of course, have had direct experience of the value of joint scrutiny.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me what's important is the framework, and it seems to me there's two clear areas. One is the role of the committees, of this committee, of my committee, and some of the other committees that exist, the standing orders that exist to enable that to happen, because we've had experience in the past where inconsistencies or limitations in standing orders have prevented that happening. But on the basis that we're talking about this, about the development of a structure of scrutiny and engagement for a reformed JMC, I think clearly there's a need for some form of rules that set the parameters of it, because one of the big issues has been where is the delineation between devolved responsibilities and non-devolved responsibilities, and also what has happened in the past where you have joint responsibilities or you have grey areas and so on, resolving those. So a statutory footing's fine, but there have to be clear parameters, clear rules, and then there has to be some form of dispute mechanism as well. Just by way of reference, a very interesting paper that's been published by Professor Rawlings, who I know has given evidence on very much on these points, on Brexit and the territorial constitution, which I think is very well worth referring to, and consideration of some of the ideas there, which I think underpin what PACAC has been saying, but also some of the other constitution committees.
I mean, can I just press you further? I mean, one of the things that I found valuable was to come down here and sit in the Assembly and answer questions on the Queen's speech, for example, so that Assembly members could actually raise issues and questions directly. I mean, could you see, for example, the Welsh Grand Committee being constituted maybe on occasions where there was a suitable subject, but including Assembly members and members of Parliament?
For me, I think the answer is yes, and I think that opportunity would be relished, provided there was a clear framework within which it was happening. And the reason being is that in the post-Brexit situation, the issue of common frameworks is going to be very fundamental in terms of the devolved governments and UK government working collectively to achieve consensus. So I think many people will buy into that as a positive constitutional development.
Because, just coming back, Clwyd, to you, it's really important that there is mutual respect and trust between the UK, the governments of the various parts of the UK, and with increased devolution, for example, to metropolitan areas and with London, perhaps there are even common issues that need to be looked at in the total picture, but that it needs to be looked at with the elected representatives for the areas that they come from. Could you see that happening in the future?
Well, yn sicrly mae 'na...
Well, certainly where there are common frameworks developing between governments and parliaments as powers over the environment or agriculture become powers held across the UK, and where there are common frameworks in such areas, and there are joint ministerial committees looking at the governance of those powers, then certainly we would have to consider what scrutiny happens of that work and where accountability lies. Now, one point that should be made here, as that Council of Ministers would be discussing a common framework on our seas or whatever else it may be, that has to be transparent so that the scrutiny of it is possible and efficient and transparent. And that's important in terms of the individual parliaments and the accountability of the elected members of those parliaments, but in very specific circumstances where powers are pooled across the UK, then I do believe that we need to consider how we carry out that scrutiny by all elected members through some specific model. Now, there may be examples where that model could be between members of Parliament and Assembly members on the basis of the Welsh Grand Committee, but generally speaking, I would anticipate those models bringing together the 4 territories of the United Kingdom on an equal basis.
To be fair, that's what I was envisaging. I come to Manon Antoniazzi. I have to say, it's all very well for politicians to talk about this and to have a political will and to see that we want to move forward. But what are the practical aspects of this? What would we need to have into parliamentary working increased? Do you think we can do it by changing standing orders? Do you think legislation is necessary? Do you think we could do it by just trying some joint meetings on certain specific subjects? How would you envisage the practical side of this work?
In response to the recommendation that you made as a committee in the past, we've looked at our standing orders, and as the Llywydd mentioned, there are no barriers in terms of standing orders to holding joint meetings. I believe that there are some barriers in Westminster standing orders, and that's something that could be looked at. But certainly, I wouldn't turn away from this idea of having joint scrutiny or joint analysis of information informally and formally. I'm sure that there is evidence that value could be added in that way. We've been planning for an increase in work. We don't know how much extra work there will be, but you're right in saying that there are practical implications for collaboration and joint working. They're going to come regardless of the withdrawal bill, and we're looking to ensure that any additional work have additional resources in terms of staff, translation from our point of view, which are required by standing orders, joint recording using the different styles of the different parliaments, and arranging that committee members have the right access to confidential information and so on. But it all comes back to this question of will. If there is political will that this work will be fruitful and productive, then we can prioritize the resources to ensure that the best work is done.
Thank you. Can I just ask a simple question? This is my ignorance. As Secretary of State, when I came down to do the Queen's speech, I could take questions from any Assembly member in the Chamber. Have you ever had any other Secretaries of State in the Chamber to be asked about their policies or a piece of legislation? Or...
Nah.
No. Only the Secretary of State for Wales. And following the Wales Act 2017, then the requirement for the Secretary of State to report on the Queen's speech has now lapsed on a legislative basis. Now, I'm sure other Assembly members would be angry with me if I didn't refer to the fact that our committees often request that Secretaries of State, particularly in the context of BrExit, should be available to committees here for scrutiny, and have found it relatively difficult to persuade Secretaries of State from Westminster to appear before committees of this place. I do accept, of course, that there are practical problems and time constraints which are relevant to all of this, but it is an issue that's been an issue for quite some time in terms of how one It's ministers who are responsible for issues which relate to the responsibilities of our committees or our assembly to provide evidence on any given matter.
I'm sorry to hear that, because I was always very willing to come here, and I think most people do. It is a question of time, possibly, but also we've received a very warm welcome here, and it's really good to be back. Have your committees asked to come to, well, it's cold in this room. Sorry, I tell you, it was the emotional welcome that we got that was warm. The atmosphere is a little cold. But I mean, is it possible for your committees to come to Westminster and hold their sessions there? I appreciate it's difficult with the translation, etc. And what about junior ministers as well, whilst there's so much pressure on some of our senior front benches at the moment because of the time provisions? Has that been tried?
Yeah, I mean, it was something that has been considered in my report, which you have a copy of, and it's absolutely right that we're moving into a new constitutional framework where the engagement, where there's been a bit defensive on both sides in terms of these issues, it completely changes because we're in a post-Brexit, we'll be in a post-Brexit arena. The constitutional relationship with the UK is in a new framework as well, and that needs to be resolved. And that means that if intra-parliamentary working is to take place, then there has to be that proper cross-engagement, whether it be ministers from here to other committees, but and vice versa. So, and I get the feeling that there is a strong willingness for that.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Now, we're going to have to go much faster, I'm afraid. Can we have short questions and short answers, please? Albeit it's all been very, very interesting and helpful. Thank you. Paul Flynn.
Do you all hear...
Thank you very much to the committee, mixed committee, for its work over the past period, and it was very helpful for us as members of Parliament. There's the committee under Hugh's leadership at the time, but the work of the committee is extremely valuable to us as members of Parliament. I don't know whether any of you have heard Mike Russell last week talking about the difference that's emerged in the relationship between Westminster and the GMC. The most significant issue is the fact that we're partners rather than people on an equal footing. So we're partners, not equals. This is the new environment to ensure the development of issue that, with regard to devolution, that we have an issue with the attitude from the centre, from Westminster, that threatens the development of devolution.
Well,
Well, returning to my answers to previous questions, ensuring that there is respect in any intergovernmental or interparliamentary work is crucially important. People should consider those relations as being a relationship of equality between the parliaments and the governments, where powers are shared or pooled, and that respect and the issue of being partners on an equal footing is hugely important, and it provides a firm foundation to the constitutions of the parliaments post-Brexit. We went into the European Union pre-devolution, we're exiting post-devolution, and what develops as that happens has to be very different to the situation previously.
So, if there was respect to the Assembly from those in Westminster, then we'd know perhaps what that would mean following Brexit. They might say that there are additional powers coming after Brexit, and that it's not a power grab, but an arrangement that is only temporary in nature. But there's not been anything said over the past few weeks about how many new powers will come to Wales. But there's this threat. People see it as a threat to the current powers. So the whole thing is a problem for us and is a threat to the process of devolution.
Well, I assume you're referring very specifically to the withdrawal bill and the debate taking place between the Welsh Government, the Scottish Government and the UK Government on Clause 11 specifically. Now, our committees in this place have provided evidence and proposed amendments to that bill so that it doesn't put the current powers of the Assembly at risk. And of course, you will be aware as a committee that there will need to be legislative consent given by this Assembly, and there will be a request for that and a vote on that at some point. And I do think that we are reflecting the political reality of the Assembly at the moment by saying that the government and a majority of Assembly members believe that if there is no change to that withdrawal bill, then that legislative consent motion won't be passed by vote of the Assembly. But things can change, of course.
A last brief question. Do you believe that Wales has set a good example in voting 3 times for our devolution here? Is that an example to ensure that we should vote at least one more time over Brexit, because some people on reflection might have changed their minds?
You're tempting me to comment on a second Brexit referendum. I'm not going to make a comment as presiding officer on that, only to say that the people of Wales have voted twice over the past 20 years to establish our current model of devolution in 1999 and in 2011. So that was the expressed desire of the people of Wales in that referendum in 2011 to have full legislative powers for this Assembly in devolved areas. And any challenge to that from any Parliament would be contrary to the desires of the people of Wales expressed in referendum in 2011. That would be very unfortunate. Mick might be tempted more than I am on the issue of a second Brexit referendum.
I'd say, first of all, is that what you're doing is underlying the absolute need for some form of underpinning, and I'd say statutory underpinning, of the JMC and the future constitutional arrangements that exist. The issue as to whether there should be a second referendum on the deal, I think it depends on the will of the people. If there's demand from people that there should be a referendum on details, now that's a political matter. It's not a matter that my committee has considered. But the principles of referenda and what you're asking people to decide upon are there for all to see.
Thank you.
Right, moving on. Sandy Martin.
Yes, the Welsh Government has submitted a continuity bill to you and is waiting for your ruling on the competence. Can you explain to us what issues, what considerations come into that, how you make that ruling?
Well,
Well, I'm not going to give you a sneak preview on my views on the issue of legislative competence. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but my role, well, I have a dual role, in fact, in deciding on whether the continuity bill is within competence, and also to decide whether that bill is in its appropriate form in terms of its introduction, and I will be making my decision on these issues over the next few weeks. I understand, of course, that there is some time imperative and some urgency surrounding all of this, given what is happening with the bill currently being scrutinised in Westminster.
Thank you. And it appears to me that the major issue with Clause 11 is the difference between the conferred powers model and the reserved matters model. And I'm wondering how you think that any ruling on competence might be able to deal with that discrepancy between these two models.
Well, oh yeah, okay then. You go.
The crux of the problem with Clause 11 is really the constitutional starting point that you come from. That is, are powers being repatriated to Westminster, or in actual fact, do they naturally go in accordance with the devolution statutes passed by Parliament, go to the areas where they devolve responsibility? And the answer to that, I don't want to go into the long constitutional language, is of course, if there were no bill, what would happen to those issues? If there were no withdrawal bill, well, they would go back in accordance with what Parliament has already directed, and that would be in the devolution statutes. So that's the starting point, and that is why it is seen as a power grab, because it retains powers that don't normally. It actually interferes with the constitutional arrangement. Professor Rawley's, again, in this paper I've recommended you, I think you can sum it up by just reading this very short paragraph. Professor Rawlings says, the sooner Clause 11 is cast aside, the better. Constitutionally maladroit, it warps the dialogue about the role and place of the domestic market concept post-Brexit. As such, the occupation of legislative and executive space in the withdrawal bill appears not only a risky venture, but also a lazy one, an unthinking form of Greater England unionism, which assumes only limited territorial difference, would be another way of characterising it. That's very common to a lot of the other evidence that's been given about it, and that is why Clause 11 is such an obstacle to legislative consent on moving forward on the withdrawal bill.
But isn't there a problem that a lot of the powers that are being repatriated from Brussels could be packaged up in a sectoral way, but that some of those may be functions which are properly held by the UK government rather than by the devolved governments, and that in order to be able to decide which of them are going to be devolved to the devolved governments and which of them are going to be held by the UK government, you need to have some sort of mechanism for triage, if you like.
There does need to be a mechanism, and it needs to be a mechanism which is fair across the devolved governments, and that's the issue where consent has actually come in, because I think there's a recognition that there are areas where there is a need for common agreement. But the assumption that effectively legislation really drives a coach and horses through our existing constitutional structure, seizes those powers, makes provision for the devolved administrations, but does not make the same provision then for England. So it is essentially dysfunctional. We should apply consistently across the whole of the UK, and that is the basis where I think there would be potential consensus.
Thank you.
Well, I think we've had a very, very interesting session. I'm sorry it's a little bit short, but we're very, very grateful to you for your evidence and indeed for your warm welcome. Thank you. Order.
Where a jumper next time.
Order, order.
Thank you, Andy. Diolch yn fawr.
The proceeding is currently suspended. The proceeding is...
Welcome our two witnesses for this last session in the Welsh Assembly of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee on interinstitutional relations within the UK. And could I ask each of our two witnesses to identify themselves for the record, please?
I'm Dr. Joanne Hunt from Cardiff Law School and the Wales Governance Centre, and I'm also a Senior Fellow with the UK in a Changing Europe initiative.
Dr. Eileen Royals dwi o Brifysgol.
I'm Dr. Eileen Royals from Aberystwyth University. I work in the International Politics Department at the university, and I'm also part of the Welsh Centre for International Affairs at Aberystwyth University.
Well, thank you and welcome. And unfortunately, we've literally got 30 minutes for this session, so we've got a very little time, and I will press straight on. We've got a binary system of devolution in this country, which may have been suitable while we were a member of the European Union, but is not suitable where we are going to have joint frameworks and what one might call shared competencies. What do you think about how we need to rearrange our devolution settlement to cope with Brexit?
Well, initially I'd say that model of it being a binary system doesn't fully capture what we are inheriting, that of course within those wide swathes of areas of EU competence, the EU's played a role, we've seen shared working across the UK, and we've seen intergovernmental working and interparliamentary working. And so we've seen, for example, JMC Europe being, to the extent that we've had a successful example of JMC, we've seen it there. Of course, there are various limitations with that, but it's the one that's worked the best. And also interparliamentary relations, particularly dating back to the move to subsidiarity review, and when that became an institutional requirement within the EU system, then we saw sort of greater cooperation between the parliaments and the EU Chairs Forum, the EC UK Forum. So we have some things to move forward with, that we've seen sort of positive co-working across government and parliament.
Just to say, I don't think that this binary model works for Wales, because we won't have reserve power models until the 2017 Act is implemented. So we're much more familiar with sharing powers, of having to collaborate across governments. As you've seen and reported in your last report, there are challenges with the international relations arrangements between governments, and where the relationships work best often is when there is a legislative basis, and in areas such as climate change, the 2008 Climate Change Act does require bodies to collaborate and so on. So I think that there are positive arrangements in place, some places. As Joe said, we are used to this, especially in the context of the European Union. We're used to having to create policy, not always in agreement, and there are effective ways of doing that to reach an UK position.
Is there any difference in between a conferral model and a reserved powers model when it comes to this question of how we share functions and competencies? Is there any substantive difference? Or is it a religious thing?
I think we'll wait and see. Whether you see there's a different starting point with those two models. I mean, one of the things, again, if we look to what we have at the moment, we have that presumption within an EU system, or we have a system which has a constitutional recognition of a principle of subsidiarity. If we see what we've got at EU and what could map across, and that provides a sort of an orientation and a presumption as to where powers would lie. Whether you can suggest that that's the difference between a reserved model and a conferred model, perhaps. So moving towards a system where there is that presumption that actions lie at the devolved level, unless the case can be made for them to be taken up a level. And I think another point to make about what we're leaving as we leave the EU is that we're leaving that constitutional consecration of a principle of subsidiarity that we have within the UK order at the moment, that we've inherited from the EU, and that there's a sort of absence of its articulation explicitly in the discussions that we're having at the moment. The JMC October principles that were agreed, although this is being seen very much as having been a positive step forward, it's quite clear subsidiarity is not explicitly one of those principles.
Slightly different points, but I do think that one of the main reasons for moving to a reserved powers models in the 2017 Act was to have greater clarity in the governance arrangements. And that's relevant to the public too, when you have a situation where 48% of people believe that the Welsh Government has powers over health, or 42% believe that policing is devolved. Then there is a problem in terms of people's understanding of what's devolved and what isn't. And the idea of moving to a reserved powers model can assist in that process. And a broader issue, at least in having a reserved model across the UK, that provides greater clarity. It's easier for civil servants in Westminster to understand the models of devolution rather than having to deal with so many different models. And the hope is that having one common model will make it easier for civil servants to respond to devolution and include officials from devolved administrations in their day-to-day work.
David Jones.
There's general agreement that the United Kingdom internal market needs to be preserved and regulated. What is required by the United Kingdom government and the United Kingdom Parliament in order to regulate that internal market?
Again, I'll go back to what we've already got. And we know that the internal market that we do have within the United Kingdom is constructed by the EU single market, the EU's internal market, and the legislative regulatory techniques there, and of course the judicial techniques there. And if we're rolling forward EU law, we could roll forward those free movement principles and apply those on a UK-wide basis. Use such techniques as the sort of pre-authorization technical specification notification, so we can leave regulatory competence where it falls at the moment, according to the devolution settlements. We could respect that, but achieve shared outcomes in other ways. And we could have the possibility of regulatory independence or autonomy unless it creates problems for the internal market. At the moment, on an EU-wide scale, that's operationalized through the states informing the Commission if they're seeking to sort of regulate on particular areas which may create barriers to trade, and then post-legislation judicial control of those. So we could exercise something like a UK internal market principle. We already have courts that understand what that means, what the internal market principle means, and sort of whether we operate that on a UK-wide basis.
To replace the role of the Commission in those circumstances?
Well, it would have to be a body that is independent from UK government, that wouldn't be reflective of any one part of the participant states. So it would be an independent commission, and we've had sort of suggestions of different institution formations that could be reconstituted at a UK level that mirror those EU institutions.
And that would clearly have to be a creation of statute, I imagine.
I would imagine so.
Yes.
An appropriate approach to do so with an institution like that. That we'd have a body that could play the role of the Commission, but we have those existing court structures that could play that role of reviewing measures after.
And that would operate at arm's length from government?
UK government?
Or any government?
Do you want to pick up on?
Forgive me, I'm just interested in the way that this body would operate. Who would it be answerable to?
So, the institution itself, if we have something commission-like, Yes, I think I need to develop these.
And write to us with
Yes.
further thoughts on that matter. And Dr. Wells, do you want to add anything?
I think there are a number of interesting ideas emerging here. Of course, the House of Commons would have a role in regulating that process and in having oversight of the work of the committee, but the idea of having joint frameworks, then you do need a robust framework in place to ensure collaboration between the various parts of the UK. We have common interest in creating an internal single market that works effectively, because in order for that system to work between various parts of the UK, but also to secure trade with other parts of the world, and there should be no regulations that have a detrimental impact on any single part of the UK, and having institutionalized mechanisms is the best approach in delivering that. So moving on from the more informal approach taken within the UK at the moment.
Permission, Dr. Hunt. Now we have 20 minutes and 5 questions, which means pretty speedy progress. Cheryl Gillan.
Yes, sir. The Welsh Government's been able to influence EU laws and regulations, presumably whilst the UK has been a member of the EU. Do you think the Welsh Government has been able to successfully influence decisions? And how do you think that's going to compare with their ability to influence decisions once we have left the EU, when the UK government will be, at the moment, the replacing body of the unelected Commission and the EU? Dr. Ross.
Thank you. The processes that have existed hitherto in order to enable the Welsh Government to influence the European Union have been very effective because of the level of collaboration between the United Kingdom government and Wales in influencing the British perspective. And those structures work very well. You've been asking this morning about problems with regard to trust. Then we have high levels of trust in the relationship between civil servants and so on in making decisions. So influencing the formal structure is one, but then there are the additional channels that Wales can take advantage of as a region through the office in Brussels, for example, to influence on the European Commission informally and so on, through influencing members of the European Parliament and through the regions. And so I think that that relationship is vital between UK Rep and the Welsh Government staff, who are treated as official diplomats of the United Kingdom out in Brussels. We have a model there, the kind of collaboration that could be repeated as we try to develop arrangements within the United Kingdom following Brexit. After leaving, there are so many questions about how the situation of the United Kingdom is going to change as a third country and what that will mean.
So you're saying that 4 MEPs from Wales and a small office in Brussels has more effect on the Brussels Commission than you expect 40 MPs and a Secretary of State's in a Wales office to have on a similar section of life that will transfer from Brussels?
No, I'm sorry, that's not what I tried to say at all. What I was trying to say was that there are additional ways of trying to get to influence. Not that they're more effective, but as a region, there are informal ways of trying to have an influence, and it's possible that these will be useful as ways for the United Kingdom government to learn from as it prepares to be a third country. There is potential to have to use informal methods. The soft diplomacy and culture are going to have to be more important, and there's a role also for the regions to be part of European networks and so on. So there is a major challenge for the Welsh Government to have an influence. As we know, the same challenge will face the United Kingdom government. We'll have to maintain the same collaboration between UK Rep and Wales out there in Brussels, and that structure's developed more widely as we think about diplomacy within the European Union following Brexit.
Anything to add, Dr. Hunt?
Just to say that, again, we're looking at the framework within which Wales and sort of Welsh interests have been articulated, that the EU has been a particularly sort of responsive and hospitable system for that, because subsidiarity is within that system. It flows throughout it. And also, you look at across the member states, the number of them that are constructed on federal lines or on devolved lines. So there's an understanding and appreciation of the regional dimension and space for that to be articulated and to be captured within sort of legislative solutions. And we can point to situations, I mean, there may not be very many that we could highlight and say, well, yes, Wales made a difference. Whether you look at something like GM and the Deliberate Release Directive and the space for local decision-making within that directive. And Wales had played a long-standing part as part of the GM-free network, so that sort of feeds into the softer sort of networking informal governance, using subsidiarity mechanisms to feed into the public procurement directive. But it's part of an atmosphere and an environment that was sort of receptive to regional and devolved issues. And
Mr. Hopkins.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. This is my question specifically to Dr. Royals, I think. How might leaving the EU affect government governance roles played by arm's-length bodies in Wales?
Yeah, dwi'n meddwl bod...
Yes, I think the arm's length bodies are important, because in talking about intergovernmental relations, what tends to happen is that we focus on the JMC and we focus on the relations between governmental organisations, but the role of external bodies is important in governmental arrangements. In the context of Brexit, we think of the organisations promoting Wales abroad, such as Wales Arts International, and the various bodies who are involved in the devolved matters, who are currently trying to collaborate with their counterparts in Westminster and at a UK level. And I think there are challenges there on occasion in terms of to what extent Wales has a sufficiently strong voice and to what extent the structures for decision-making within the UK organisations give Wales enough of an influence, be that within the British Council or in terms of more strategic decisions in campaigns such as Britain is Great, which is tourism. Now, Brexit actually highlights the importance of international relations, and creating trading relationships and tourism and culture plays an important role in this. But to what extent do these organisations who are involved in these processes on a day-to-day basis have sufficient influence on the UK decisions which contribute to Wales's role internationally?
It leads on to my supplementary, which is how might this affect the power of the National Assembly of Wales to implement policy in areas of devolved competence?
Yeah,
well, the main area I've been looking at in this area is international affairs and the international relations of the Welsh Government, and in a range of areas, and it goes back to the previous question, there has been some sharing of power. There aren't binary arrangements in place. There are some powers held at Westminster and some at a devolved level, and they are well used to dealing with each other and seeking influence. The challenge is, as we see more generally in intergovernmental relationship, is the informality of the process and the lack of formal structures and the lack of influence of the Welsh Government in decision-making, or if decisions are devolved to the arm's-length bodies, then how much influence do they have practically on the decisions taken by the UK-wide body? In a number of areas we do see close collaboration. For example, many Welsh Government offices are located in foreign consulates. Now, there is potential there for collaboration in the same way as we see in Brussels at the moment between the Wales office in Brussels and UK rep. We need to emulate these kinds of processes, and where joint decision-making needs to happen, then we need to strengthen the Welsh Government's voice in those processes.
Thank you. A quick supplementary, Mr. Flynn.
Thank you very much for your evidence. Do you believe that the whole thing is a matter of trust and confidence between Westminster and Cardiff, or between Cardiff and the European Union, and the whole thing will depend on who wins the battle within the government at the moment for those people who want to jump over the cliff edge and those who want to go on very carefully to ensure that the relationships will continue.
I think we have seen various kinds of intergovernmental relations with various parties in power, and the emphasis has been on informal ad hoc relations, as your previous report emphasized. I do think that we need more formal structures in place, more concrete structures, because culture isn't going to create those arrangements, and this is more than a matter of political parties or an issue of opinions on Brexit. We need robust arrangements in place so that the appropriate decisions can be made for the coming challenges and the challenges in terms of the post-Brexit arrangements.
The proposed increase in all these overlapping competencies after we leave the EU, just wondered what needs to change to make inter-institutional arrangements fit for purpose, because we keep hearing that, yeah, it's very joined up at the moment.
Just to reiterate what we've seen coming from recommendations from across committees, your own committee, House of Lords committees and committees here from the Assembly, that need for perhaps a statutory underpinning, but a more formal set of systems to go forward for intergovernmental and interparliamentary working. The situation we have at the moment, if there's not that trust between personalities and how much it has been driven at the personal level up until now, we need to generate sort of trust in the institutions and trust in the systems. And so having a system where there is that obligation to meet every month, that that is written in a way could assist, go towards creating that trust in the institutions.
I agree entirely. I think we're seeking institutional solutions here. We have tried using 20 years of culture in creating these relationships. It's challenging. There are so many demands on governments and civil servants. It's not something that comes naturally, and we do need to find institutional solutions to create structures which will allow close collaboration. And as I mentioned earlier, when we look at the collaboration between UK Rep and the devolved offices in Brussels, they work with each other, they engage with each other. There is a high level of trust, to such an extent that they trust in the devolved governments and in the officials of the devolved governments to attend meetings such as COBRA and the structures of the European Union to represent them at that level. And I think that's an example that relationship can have a very positive impact, but that needs to be arranged, and a statutory framework for that would be a clear solution.
Thanks.
Rupa Huq, have you finished?
I think so, yeah. So placing everything on a statutory footing would formalise it rather than this sort of as and when at the moment.
Yes, but it depends on what it is in terms of the JMC and so on. It's important that there are elements of that which are on a statutory basis. But as I mentioned earlier, I think we need to consider the range of intergovernmental relations, the work of departments, but also the external bodies and how they work, how we can create more consistency in terms of the arrangements between all of those, because we can't expect the leaders of government to meet more often than twice a year. Now, ministers could do so maybe every month. But what of those day-to-day relationships? As we know, there are good relations between officials on various levels, but on occasion those relations aren't as strong as they should be, and I think we could create a more robust arrangement for that. I'm not sure if we need a statutory framework for that, but we need to think about what's appropriate for all the different levels involved.
Ronnie Cowan.
Yeah, thanks very much. We've heard about soft diplomacy, and we've also heard about high levels of trust between civil servants, but as these talks go forward, how do we build that trust and respect between the UK legislative bodies throughout the United Kingdom and between them and the civil service, which we've heard even this week has been talked down by members of the actual Conservative backbenches?
It's a challenge, isn't it? And things have declined, unfortunately, over the past few weeks, as you heard from Cadwyn Jones this morning. And the EU withdrawal bill doesn't quite help matters. So I think we need to change the culture swiftly, and personally I think it's only through proposing formal structures for intergovernmental relationships that can be achieved, including forms for dealing with disagreement or disputes, so that we overcome this current context of declining relationships and a lack of trust. It's very difficult to move on from this without having more robust structures in place to deal with these issues.
Can you have a formal structure without a lack of if there's a lack of mutual respect?
Well, at present we're facing a situation where a lack of structure suggests that that's the situation that's arisen, at least in creating and requiring dialogue. The hope is that things would improve, I think.
But at least the dialogue would take place, or there would be a forum for that dialogue. I mean, at the moment we know that there were those long periods where meetings didn't happen. But if there's that obligation to meet and to get around a table.
But when it's done by obligation, is that not a case of people have been forced into it? I'm always of the mind that if people could do it in a more social aspect, then they build up to a working relationship. You know, people who just work together sometimes don't see each other as human beings and understand the difficulties we've got. So if we get the mixture of having people together on a non-formal basis where they get to maybe actually like each other as human beings, then there's a possibility they can work together better and more constructively anyway. But it's which comes first, I suppose?
I think when we look around the world in intergovernmental relationships, formal structures tend to help the relationship. Perhaps the informal element will arise if they meet for supper before a meeting or afterwards. And of course there is room in developing relationships for that, but in at least developing that formal relationship, then it will require those discussions to happen jointly to improve the situation at present with regard to intergovernmental relationships.
I spoke recently to people from Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, and the Baltic states have got that relationship going, and it is sometimes quite icy. There's not always that feeling that there's a mutual love around the room. They understand the common goals they have to pull together and to make themselves strong as the Baltic states. We don't seem to have that. So that's a statement, not a question.
Well, thank you very much indeed for a most interesting session, and we may write to you a little bit more for some further thoughts and detail, particularly about the joint parliamentary scrutiny of these arrangements. But I'm very grateful for you being with us today. Order, order.